My name is Frank James. I was told I was named after my mother's late father, not the outlaw despite relentless teasing and more than a few fist fights in my school years. I didn't always win those fights, but I never ran from one. I'm originally from Missouri, the birthplace and burial place of the outlaw Jesse James. I guess that's why every a-hole there wanted to fight me. Things changed when I moved to Philadelphia and I could stop fighting and live in peace. My wife Jessie and I met in a college organic chemistry class on the first day of our freshman year. When the professor read the roll, he commented that if Jesse Ivins, whose name came right before mine, married me, we would be Frank and Jesse James. We all laughed. Jesse and I had lunch together that day and every other day for the next 4 years. 2 months after we met, we were intimate for the first time during a weekend at the Tropicana Hotel in the Chelsea neighborhood of Atlantic City. The song Chelsea Morning by Joni Mitchell was always our song after that weekend. Among the first questions that Jesse ever asked me was my opinion of men who beat their wives. I thought that was weird and explained that I would never dream of hitting my wife or any other woman. Then Jesse explained that her father frequently beat her mother and that's why they divorced. I hugged and kissed Jesse and swore I would never hit her. I'd been in more than a few fights in Missouri because as a child I had a hard time learning to keep my temper. I knew I had a violent side and fought hard to control it. It became easier as I became older. We married a month after we graduated. We didn't have a lot of money, so we had our honeymoon back at the Tropicana Hotel in the Chelsea section of Atlantic City, the site of our first intimacy. I had been working since high school in the warehouse and trucking department of a local pharmaceutical company. Even though I now had a college degree, I didn't leave because I was making more money than the average college graduate and was fast-tracked to eventually run the whole department when the present manager retired in 2 years. With my help, Jesse was also hired by the company. It's a great company that treats its employees like partners, not slaves. And that philosophy flows down from the very top. Toxic managers don't last long before they're counseled, and if that doesn't change their attitude, they're fired. Anthony Capri has been the president since forever. He spends an hour each day visiting a different department and getting to know each of his employees. He can tell you how many children each of us have, though he doesn't remember all the names. Most of his employees would walk through fire for him. My wife, Jessie, has always been a flirt. During our 20-year marriage, we've had many arguments over her flirtatious behavior. Sometimes I think she does it just to get a rise out of me. Yet despite this character flaw, I believe that Jessie has always been faithful and never cheated on me and our children. I believe that someone who cheats on their spouse is also cheating on their children. Of course, over 20 years I've been tempted to cheat, but I never did. I must, however, admit that more than once after seeing a Jennifer Connelly movie I imagined that I was making love to her and while being intimate with my wife. I don't think that's cheating, but I can't be sure. I do know that if given a choice between one night with Jennifer Connelly or my wife, though I might be tempted, I would undoubtedly choose to be with my wife. I still love her that much. My father, who is a zoologist, calls me a swan. He says that because, like swans, I made it for life. He knows me very well. Until the past year or so, men were always coming on to her. Now she's a few pounds heavier, has some gray in her hair and lines on her face. Now show that she's given birth to 3 children. Men rarely flirt back with her. Once my wife hit 40, her flirting intensified as fewer men flirted back. I think she desperately wants to prove that she's still desirable. One night at a block party, all the men were ignoring my wife and paying attention to the new 25-year-old woman who moved onto our street with her husband. My wife hated that woman on sight. In the past, my wife had always had the eye of all the men. Now she wasn't even in the running and it was killing her. I made a big fuss over how pretty her dress was and how beautiful she was, but it had no effect on her. She said I had to tell her those things because I was her husband. I said that I told her that because it was the truth. Jessie is a pharmaceutical representative for the same drug company where I work. She travels to doctors' offices and explains the latest drugs that our company has developed. Half of her job is to flirt with the doctors, so she loves her job. I now manage 50 employees at the trucking, shipping, and warehouse department for the same company, but in a different building a few miles away from my wife's office. Sometimes I take off my tie and jacket to help load trucks if someone is out sick, so I'm in pretty good shape. I don't have to do that, but it gains me respect from my employees, and that makes my job easier. Twice a year our company paid a consultant a fortune to conduct team-building exercises, which I found to be a total waste of time and money. Once a month I take everyone out for beer. I persuaded the company to pay for these outings as a team-building experience. The company president Anthony Capri liked and approved my idea, and now every department does it. It's cheaper and much more effective. Occasionally Mr. Capri joins us. Once over a beer session with the warehouse crew, he said there was more innate intelligence in our trucking department than all of the Harvard Business School. He's gone through 4 different Harvard MBAs as vice presidents in the last 10 years, as he tried unsuccessfully to groom each one to take over from him. We're a close-knit company. Mr. Capri has known me for over 20 years and trusts my judgment. When there was a problem in the accounting department, he asked me to take several of the employees one-on-one out to lunch over beer to identify the problem. Their new manager was a shit who timed how long people were in the bathroom and berated them in front of everyone if in his opinion they took too long. Mr. Capri counseled the manager on his behavior, but it didn't change and Mr. Capri fired him. Then things returned to normal in that department. Mr. Capri wanted me to take college courses on human resources for a promotion to that department, but I respectfully declined, which disappointed Mr. Capri. I like my present job, I told him. 4 times a year my wife must travel to a different city for a week of training on new drugs. Even after 20 years I still miss her, and I'm miserable when she leaves on those trips. Lately my wife wasn't interested in being romantic with me. She either had a headache or was too tired. For me, sex wasn't just about physical love, it was mostly about intimacy. It was how we showed what we meant to one another, and now I realized I no longer meant that much to my wife, the love of my life. She was drifting away from me, and I didn't know why despite repeatedly asking her. At her department's Christmas party I met Nick, the newest and youngest pharmaceutical rep in her department. My wife had been bending my ear about Nick for the past few weeks. Now I understand what was wrong in my marriage. My wife was glowing as she introduced me to Nick. Nick told me that I was with the most beautiful woman at the party. Jesse blushed. I instantly knew what his plans were with my wife. He wasn't subtle but was silently thinking that he would take my wife from me, at least for a few hours. He was handsome, athletic and unlike me had a full head of hair. I'm more than a little sensitive about becoming bald. Nick's handshake was so strong and painful that I wondered why he was trying so hard to assert some kind of dominance over me, as he smirked at my wife. At that point my spidey senses were on high alert. I squeezed back until he grimaced in pain. Loading trucks made my hands very strong. Sometimes during a break the guys and I will arm wrestle. Though I'm no longer the strongest in the crew, I can hold my own. I enjoyed making him feel pain. I didn't like the way my wife looked at him, like he was a prize she wanted to win, which was the exact same way he was looking at her. I'm not much of a dancer, but I try. Jessie danced with Nick as much as she danced with me, and I was angry and let her know. She dismissed my concerns without a second thought, as though my feelings no longer were important to her. Mr. Capri, the president of the company, asked for everyone's attention. He said that this company was one kind of team, and that many members of this team were on another team with their partners and families. The company often asked people to work late or travel, which kept them away from their families. I believe that it's important for our company to support the home life of our employees. In his way of thinking, the importance of the families supporting his employees was crucial to the success of the company. He asked all the spouses to stand up. He began clapping and everyone joined him. Then he walked around and handed each spouse or partner a check for $500 to show that his appreciation was more than lip service. A few weeks after New Year's, my wife had to attend an out-of-town training session, along with all the other reps in her office, including Nick. In preparation, my wife bought some new clothes and some new lingerie at Victoria's Secret, which she didn't announce, but neither did she keep it a secret. For me, the final straw was her trip to the hairdresser the week before she left to have her hair dyed to remove the gray. I voiced my fear to her, but she dismissed me as being overly jealous, but she couldn't look me in the eye. I put my hands on her shoulders. If I even suspect you've been unfaithful to me, I'll divorce you immediately and never look back. I've never slept with Nick. My wife responded. She was now in damage control mode. Have you had lunch with him? I asked and she nodded yes. Have you gone out for drinks with him after work? I also asked and she also nodded yes. Have you discussed our marriage with him? Again her faithful nod yes. I was afraid to ask her if she had kissed him. I was sure she had. Then in my mind you're already having at least an emotional affair with him, and it must stop right now. Jessie straightened her back. Don't give me orders, you're my husband, not my slave owner. I didn't need to be hit over the head with a baseball bat to figure out what she was planning on doing with Nick when they went away together for the company seminar. Maybe Nick was the one who needed to be hit over the head with a baseball bat, and I was just the guy to make it happen. I had a childhood friend Dennis, who went to prison for beating up his wife's boyfriend. When he was released, he couldn't get a job except for washing cars even though he was a college graduate. I convinced my company to hire him. I fought for him all the way up to the company president, Mr. Capri, who agreed. Nick posed no threat to anyone else. The president, at my urging, started a program to hire ex-cons for the loading dock and other positions. 48 of the 50 ex-cons we hired never gave us a moment's trouble. I don't want to talk about the other two. I try to reason with people, but those two guys brought out my violent side, and when they learned I wasn't a pushover they quit a little worse for wear. There was a story about how successful the program was in the local newspaper, which was picked up by a local TV station, and then it was shown on the TV network all over the nation about how responsible companies like ours helped former prisoners integrate back into society. It secured a lot of good press for the company and our president. Mr. Capri was presented with an award by our state's governor, which was also reported nationally on TV. In turn, he invited me and Jessie to dinner to thank me for coming up with the program, and allowing him to take the credit on TV for what was really my program. I was flattered and amazed that he took the time for us. My wife worked in his building and they already knew each other. He was in his early 80s and treated us both like his grandchildren. He said that the company spent millions on public relations, but that I produced more positive news for the company than the entire PR department had in the past 5 years. He was grateful, and if I ever needed a favor, to just call him. He handed me a card with his personal cell phone number. I was on cloud 9.5. Even my wife, who had occasionally looked down on my decidedly blue-collar job, was now proud of me. My happiness was short-lived. I couldn't sleep one night as I worried about my wife going on this upcoming business trip with Nick. I wanted to threaten him, but I didn't want to lose my job or worse, go to prison. I learned from my ex-con workers about prison, so I didn't want to even visit one. I spoke with my friend Dennis, who went to prison for beating his wife's lover. I told him about Nick and asked for advice. He said that for $5,000 untraceable dollars his former cellmate would take care of the problem for me. I rejected that advice. If anyone was going to beat the crap out of Nick, it would be me. Maybe I wouldn't have to beat him. Maybe I could scare him away from my wife. I know that the government has mandated that every computer printer or copy machine must print a small microcode on each page that identifies what printer the page came from. I knew not to use my home printer or the one in my office for my plan. I learned Nick's email from a company directory. I went to a Best Buy store and quickly and surreptitiously sent Nick an email from a demonstration computer with a fictitious email account warning him that men who cheat with married women are sinful and can face severe and painful consequences for their immoral behavior, up to and including being hit by lightning or maybe brass knuckles. Of course, I wore a floppy hat, sunglasses, and a face mask, and Best Buy Sonos security footage could be used to identify me. Much to my shock and surprise, Nick responded to me directly by email, bragging that he wasn't scared of me and would sleep with whomever he wanted. That if my wife no longer found me desirable, it was my problem and not his. I didn't back down. I suggested that we meet at the boxing ring at a local gym and settle this like men. Though he was younger, I believed I was stronger and certainly more motivated. The next morning, I was summoned to the office of the president again. This time I believed I was in trouble, though I wondered why the president was involved and not my direct manager or HR. I walked into the plush office only to see Nick seated on a couch next to Mr. Capri, and my wife seated in a chair opposite Nick. I thought I was about to be fired and maybe even divorced. I had trouble breathing. The president said, "Nick, I want you to empty your pockets onto this coffee table." Nick took out an iPhone. Mr. Capri took it and stopped it from recording our conversation. He looked at Frank and me with a stern, unforgiving gaze. Frank thinks that you're trying to seduce his wife, and Nick thinks you've threatened him with violence. When you challenged him to a boxing match, he went to HR. HR took his complaint seriously and kicked it upstairs to me. I was about to speak when the president lit a cigar and told me to remain silent. He turned to Nick. Nick, let me be blunt. Years ago, my wife left me for some slick-talking shit. She broke my heart and took half for my money. Karma caught up with him 2 years later in a hit-and-run car accident with a car that looked suspiciously like mine. Apparently he was injured so badly that he could no longer be intimate with my wife, and she unsuccessfully begged me to take her back. I abhor cheating, seducing ladies' men. Further, since I know that you and Frank's wife will both be at the training sessions, I want you to know that I've instructed our head of security to keep a close watch on you too. If I even suspect that you so much as hold the hand of Jessie or any married woman who works for me, you'll be out on your butt before closing time for violating our company's moral clause in your contract, and then I would advise you to carefully look both ways before you cross a life. I want the spouses of my employees to know that extramarital affairs are not tolerated here, and that their marriages are safe from predation at work. Do you understand what I'm telling you? Nick turned white as he nodded yes. Nick, you're very good at your job, but you're no longer a teenager and must stop acting like one. You can have a great career in this company if and only if you grow up and conduct yourself in a moral way. Since we sell ethical drugs, we must all behave ethically not just in our professional lives but our personal lives. We have a reputation for being responsible. Never lose sight of that. I was amazed as the president continued. Frank works with a group of ex-cons, some of whom have violent pasts. He's given them a chance to turn their lives around when no one else would. These men would go to hell and back for him if he just snapped his fingers. Nick, I've probably saved you from having your teeth bashed in and your legs broken in a back alley by a masked man, and I don't mean the Lone Ranger. Unless of course Frank did it himself, which he's quite capable of doing. That's just a word to the wise. Nick was in shock and excused himself to go to the bathroom, though it may have been too late judging by how he ran. The president turned to my wife. Jessie, if your loving loyal husband can't trust you, why should I? If you'll cheat and lie to him, why would you be honest with your employer? You have a wonderful, compassionate, caring husband. Don't ruin your marriage for some cheap piece of shit like Nick. My wife began crying. I put my arms around her as she kept saying she was ashamed of herself. She thanked me and the president for stopping a train wreck just a few days before it would certainly have happened. Then he turned to me. I don't want you to acknowledge whether you sent that threatening email to Nick. I believe you did and I'm very impressed that you did. I was really overjoyed by your boxing challenge. Running this company requires a just and compassionate hand most of the time. Sometimes, however, you must be a mean, semi-violent son of a gun. I can be both, and now I know that you can be both. I also know that you're a natural leader, and a company like ours doesn't need a manager. It requires a leader. In a year I'm retiring. I don't want you wasted in the warehouse any longer. I want you to spend a month in each of our main departments so that a year from now you can take over the reins for me. You have a degree in organic chemistry. You'll be spending 1 day a week with our researchers, so you'll soon be up to speed on advances in pharmaceuticals. This company has been my baby for over 50 years, and I'll be damned if I'll let some a-hole MBA run it into the ground when I'm no longer here to protect it. Trust your department heads, they won't steer you wrong, but when they disagree you'll have to mediate and make the final decision. I want you and Jessie to take a week off and travel to any place on earth you want on the company's dime, and then come back rested and ready to hit the ground running. I looked at Jessie and hummed the tune from Chelsea Morning. She nodded her head in agreement. We both knew where we needed to go to reconnect. After we left Mr. Capri's office, my wife congratulated me on my incredible promotion with a passionate kiss. She whispered in my ear, "Would you have really beaten Nick up?" I nodded yes, I would beat the crap out of anyone who messes with our marriage. I have a violent streak that I've always tried to control. I guess it's genetic. I've kept a secret from you and everyone else in my life. I really am the great-great-great-grandson of the outlaw Jesse James. My wife Jessie nearly squeezed the life out of me. We went back to Atlantic City for a lust and love-filled weekend. We had a Chelsea afternoon and evening. We never got out of bed except to go to the bathroom. Coming out of the bathroom, my wife stood naked in front of a full-length mirror. I'm having a difficult time accepting that I'm no longer young and pretty. She turned to me. How can you still want to make love to an aging, sagging, graying woman like me? I got up and held her in my arms. Because I still see the beautiful young girl I fell in love with so many years ago. Can that be enough for you? Jessie knocked me down onto the bed and ravaged me all night until Chelsea morning. Now for the second story. I was madly in love with my wife Judy for 20 years, ever since the night I met her at a college graduation party. We had never met before that day, even though we attended the same college for 4 years. What most impressed me that day was my wife's knowledge of the expensive scotch she brought to the party, which we all enjoyed as we sang along to various Beatles songs, especially when I'm 64 in a semi-drunken stupor. Her father owned and she worked at his high-end liquor store. We spent the next hour talking about whiskey and bourbon. She invited me to a whiskey tasting that weekend at the store. We've been together ever since. She still works there as the office manager. I sell carpeting. It's not a very exciting job, but with the addition of my wife's paycheck it pays the bills. My wife and I love Beatles songs. When I'm 64, the DJ played at our wedding for our first dance. We have 3 children, Vera, Chuck and Dave, in honor of our favorite song. When my wife was pregnant again with a girl, we couldn't decide whether to name her Lucy or Rita, also from Beatles songs. Unfortunately, my wife suffered a miscarriage and frankly she never recovered from the loss. Nothing I said or did to comfort her worked. She blamed me for the loss because I had been so insistent that we have a 4th child. Looking back, I think that was the beginning of the end to our marriage. She no longer wants intimacy with me or even to hug me. I hope that she just needed a few months to recover from the miscarriage and that I had to be patient with her. For my 40th birthday last year, my father-in-law gave me a $600, 25-year-old bottle of Glenlivet Scotch. I hadn't yet opened it. I was saving it for a special occasion. My wife gave me a gym membership as she told me to lose the beer belly and take better care of myself. She also suggested that I get hair plugs to fix my receding hairline. She isn't subtle. She works out at the gym twice a week and weighs the same as she did the day I met her. I admit that I've let myself go a bit. I can find the time to work out or earn a living, but I don't have the energy for both. A month later I had a hard day at work when I was undercut on price and lost a large commercial sale. I had spent the past 2 weeks working on it. I came home looking forward to sampling that scotch in consolation. I opened the liquor cabinet and found that the bottle had been opened, and about 4 shots of scotch were gone. I was furious. I had 3 teenage children and I wanted to know which one broke the rules to drink alcohol, and not just any alcohol but from this exorbitantly expensive bottle. I instantly knew that each of my kids would point to the others and I'd never get at the truth. I bought and installed a motion sensor camera in the bookshelf opposite the liquor cabinet. When I learned which of my kids drank the scotch, there would be hell to pay. Loss of car privileges for at least a month would just be the starting point. I'm not a strict disciplinarian, but I do set strict limits on important issues like underage drinking or drug use. Frankly, I was surprised that one of my kids would test me like this. It was uncharacteristic because they were good kids, but I guess teenagers need to rebel sometimes and see if they can stretch the boundaries of what their parents will tolerate. 3 days later I saw that even more scotch was missing. I removed the memory card from the hidden camera and placed it on my computer. I was shocked, astounded and furious to discover a video of my half-naked wife with a completely naked man as he poured himself and my wife some of my scotch. He wasn't younger than I was. He wasn't in better shape, so I didn't understand why she was intimate with him. However, one look at his Johnson as she licked scotch off it, and I suddenly understood what she saw in him. I have never cheated on my wife, and I would never have believed that my wife of 20 years would ever cheat on me if I hadn't seen the irrefutable evidence. I realized that if I didn't immediately leave the home to cool off, I would do something that would put my wife in a hospital and me in jail when she returned home. I got onto my bicycle and pedaled away for a few hours and 20 miles until I calmed down. For me, 2 hours of bike riding does more to reduce stress than 2 hours of drinking. As an added benefit, I don't wake up with a hangover. The irony of this is that because my wife works at a liquor store, I could buy all the booze I wanted at an enormous discount. I wish she worked at a bicycle store. I knew I would divorce my wife, but I needed revenge on this marriage breaking a hole who thought he could take my wife and my booze. He had destroyed my life and I would make sure he paid for it. If you called me a vindictive SOB, you'd be right. My wife was safe because she was the mother of my children, and I could never bring myself to harm her. I came up with a plan. It was more of an inspiration. I bought another motion sensor camera, but this one was Wi-Fi enabled. When triggered, it would send me a live video on my iPhone. There are a couple of semi-shady ex-cons who work on the loading dock of my company. I bought $200 of the date narco, Rohypnol, from one of them and then gave him another $200 to forget it ever happened. I returned home that night to discover more of my booze gone. This wasn't a one-time betrayal, this was a longer-term affair in my mind. I warmed up a tumbler of scotch so it would dissolve completely, and placed more than a few Rohypnol tablets in it, then poured it all back into the scotch bottle. I believed that this shit came to my house 3 times a week at about noon. I would be ready for him. I bought an identical bottle of the scotch and emptied a little bit of it. I hid the pristine bottle in a cabinet near the liquor cabinet. 2 days later I was at work when my iPhone told me that it was scotch party time once again. I was disgusted to see him licking the scotch off her body. Rohypnol needs about 30 minutes to take effect. That was also the amount of time I needed to drive home from work. I told my boss that I felt sick and drove home. This excuse for going home to satisfy the police was also part of my plan. I parked in my driveway and silently entered through the back door. I found my wife and her lover sound asleep on the living room floor. His clothes were strewn about. I placed some Rohypnol pills in his pants pocket, and I replaced the drugged scotch bottle with the pristine one. I removed the hidden cameras and placed them in my car, then I went upstairs, changed all the sheets on our bed and brought down some clothing for my naked wife. After I dressed her, I carried her, the hidden cameras, dirty sheets and a tampered scotch bottle, and the glasses they had used into my car and drove 5 minutes away to the house of my waiting sister. My sister and I exchanged cars. My sister and unconscious wife then drove to our beach house in Mexico 2 hours away, and I returned home where I broke a small window pane, which would make it appear that someone broke it to unlock and open my front door. My wife's naked lover was still sprawled out on the floor. I phoned 911 to report that a crazy naked man broke into my house and attacked me. Then I punched the unconscious scumsucker hard in his nose and kicked him twice as hard between his legs. For good measure, I crushed the fingers on his right hand with my foot. A few minutes later the police arrived and I went outside to meet them. I explained that I found a naked man in my house and he attacked me, so I fought back. I showed them my ID to prove that I lived here. I told the police that I'd never seen this man before and I was in fear for my life. I asked them to check the rest of the house to determine if there were any more people hidden there. I also explained that my wife was visiting with my sister 100 miles away in Mexico. The unconscious man was handcuffed, arrested and transported to a hospital jail ward. I followed the police to the station to make out a report. I was later told that when he regained consciousness, he was handcuffed to the hospital bed. He was disoriented and didn't understand what was happening at first. Then he claimed that he had been invited into my house by my wife and for some reason lost consciousness. The police had searched the house and knew that my wife wasn't there. He claimed that he had been intimate with my wife for months. They had been so discreet, however, that no one knew about them, and no one could corroborate his story. He claimed that somehow I must have drugged him. He explained that he drank some of my scotch. The police returned to my house, examined the clean bed sheets, and took away the unadulterated bottle of scotch for lab analysis. My sister knew everything that had happened and threatened my wife with exposure of her affair to the world if she alibied her lover. I demanded that my wife remain in Mexico, away from any subpoena forcing her to testify for her lover until after his trial. I wanted that scumsucker in jail and I promised her a better divorce settlement if she complied. The perp phoned his wife and begged her to bail him out of jail, but as she learned why he was in jail, she refused. A few days later the lab reported that he did have the date narco in his system, but none was found in the bottle of scotch. They believe that he intentionally took the narco, some of which was found in his pants pocket on the living room floor. Some people use it intentionally for the high it could produce. He was sentenced to 90 days in jail. He was my wife's dentist and lost his license because of the drugs found on him. Of course, with the fingers on his right hand broken, he wouldn't have been able to practice dentistry anyway. I waited 3 months to divorce my wife. We rented our house, so that wasn't an issue. I gave her a 60-40 split of all our assets as I had promised if she wouldn't testify in her boyfriend's defense. Trying to keep more would have cost me more in legal bills than I would have saved. She knew better than to fight it. I never told my children or anyone else the truth. As far as everyone knew, my wife had been faithful, but we had grown tired of each other. That was 25 years ago. I haven't yet met a beautiful woman 10 years younger who has fallen insanely in love with me, though I did join a gym to try and tone up my body, but I'm afraid it didn't work, or at least not in the 3 months I tried it. Of course I miss my wife, but I could never reconcile with her because I could never again trust her. When her dentist or lover got out of jail, they reconnected, and after both of their divorces they married each other. Her new husband works at his father-in-law's liquor store. It's a far cry from being a rich dentist. At the first birthday party for my oldest grandson, my ex-wife's new husband had a few drinks and yelled at me for drugging him and ruining his life. "You're just saying that to make me feel good," I taunted as I laughed in his face. After their mother's 20th wedding anniversary to her second husband, our children informed me that she was happy. Even though I've been alone all these years, I don't regret divorcing her. I couldn't live with a cheater. If I can't trust a woman, I can't love her. A few times a year I travel to Nevada, where adult entertainment is legal, to spend time with an escort named Cindy. Sometimes we aren't even intimate and I just take her out for dinner because I miss female companionship. Cindy knows my life story, and she came up with an idea that I loved. What keeps me sane is that my 3 children live just a few minutes away. I babysit for my grandchildren a few days a week, and that fills me with more joy than I can explain. The scientists who claim that there is no such thing as a perpetual motion machine have never met my 2-year-old grandson John or his 3-year-old cousin Lucy. After my grandkids run me rag for a few hours, their parents take them home, and I usually fall asleep on my couch because I'm too tired to walk upstairs to my bedroom. It's the best kind of tired. My wife's cheating denied me the life I dreamt of, but my grandchildren are more than adequate compensation. I guess that once a cheater is always a cheater is a truism. When her new husband turned 63, my ex-wife caught him cheating with a 30-year-old woman on his birthday. He met my special friend Cindy when she came into the liquor store, and Cindy seduced him as a favor to me. My ex received a text telling her to go to a motel room to see her husband with another woman. It cost me more than a couple of dollars, but I love revenge. Our divorce was so far in the past that no one thought I had anything to do with it. As they say, revenge is a dish best served cold. The next week my ex and I were both at our daughter's house when my crying ex-wife criticized me for not being empathetic to her pain. She said I couldn't understand how much it hurt to have someone I loved betray me. That was when I realized how stupid she was. Judy decided she didn't need her new husband and would no longer feed him. She divorced him now that he was 64.
Now start second story.
Janet is a really short-statured woman. At barely 5 feet, she would be easily overlooked in a crowd if only she weren't so beautiful and perfectly shaped. Sometimes I call her my fairy pixie. She shines with energy and positive enthusiasm. Her face actually glows and her eyes sparkle with happiness. All our 22 years of married life have been filled with her sparkle and tireless work, raising our 2 now young adult children. She can be witchy, meaning she wants her way regardless, but we usually talk it through, and then she gets her way once I understand what it is all about. We have shared joys and sorrows together. Our lives are so intertwined that I can't even think of life without her. She tells me the same, and I have always believed her until... well, that's all about this story. I find myself in southwest England helping a fellow general practitioner in his practice. I'll be here another 11 months until my 1-year contract runs out. Through friends I found out that Great Britain was recruiting international physicians for its National Health Service. This opportunity provided me with the perfect retreat from reality and space for my cheating wife. At 44, the same age as my wife, I still have lots of life ahead of me, life alone possibly. If not alone, then certainly life is terribly disrupted by events that recently came to my attention. I had a small cottage. It was typical English countryside and only a quarter-mile from the office I worked in. I could walk or bicycle to work. My salary was adequate and the working conditions perfect for me. I had plenty of English-style social life which I rather enjoyed. When folks found that I was estranged and in a divorce proceeding, I was amazed at the truly cute and vivacious young women who were interested in my social well-being. As of right now, I limit my social life to group activities which included a few double dates, and I haven't even kissed any lassie yet. I really didn't want to. I wanted my wife back big time. My heart ached for the time before I became aware of her cheating. Words cannot express the emptiness of life within and around me without my Janet. That is, without my exclusive Janet. It was her revelation that she was sharing her body with her young lover that drove me away. It was her demand that I allow her to continue that I could not handle. Yes, she wanted to continue to be married to me. Nothing had changed in her behavior toward me. It was when I discovered her ongoing affair and the depth of its emotional nature that I left her and my marriage. Well, before all this, I had given up my private practice because of the administrative problems caused by cheating HMOs and giant insurance companies, among other things. I had taken to being a locum tenens physician. This allowed me to frequently be at home during otherwise normal working hours. Sometimes I would work in an emergency room for a weekend, making enough for a week's income and 2 12-hour shifts. All without any administrative junk except keeping up my license, CME and malpractice insurance. When our second son left home for college, Janet wanted to go back to work. That was fine with me. She wanted to be useful and earn some income also. She said she wanted to find a challenge in life and work to be successful. For years we had had separate bank accounts. That way each of us could have our checkbooks whenever we wanted. We each had our own separate credit cards also. For the past 3 years since Janet had been working, she put her salary into her own checking account and paid her own credit card. For many years Janet had paid all our bills, whether mine or hers, they were always ours. That is until she got a job and a separate credit card. Now we had my bills, which were things like taxes, insurance, utility bills, home loan payments, food bills and gasoline. My income went exclusively into my account, and her income into her account. Then there were her bills. These were for her cosmetics, clothing and her credit cards. I never bothered to look at her bank statements or credit cards. I trusted her and she never asked me for money anymore. As a result of our both working, even with the kids' college expenses, we began to move money away for retirement in our separate IRAs. Other than our separate income and expenses, we continued to share everything in common. Our sex life was vanilla and not frequent enough for me, but I had no real complaints. She was still energetic in bed, but we had decreased frequency to not even twice a week. Sometimes she wanted me to do things that I just couldn't do. She wanted me to play dom and sub with her. When she told me what it was, I just couldn't do it. I felt like I would be humiliating her. After a couple of times pillow talking about it, we just dropped the subject. It all sounded so kinky to me. Calling one master or slave just was degrading to me. I discounted this to just normal fantasy stuff. Janet worked for a large group of physicians. This group was a major off-campus site for medical students and even residents to take preceptorships. As a result, medical trainees were frequently in the office attached to different doctors. My wife worked as a nurse for 2 of the family physicians in the group. She had frequent contact with medical students and residents in training. I got home early from work one afternoon while Janet was still at work. As I drove in, I got the mail from the mailbox along with the daily paper. Usually Janet does this. The mail and paper are sorted out and ready for me to read when I get home. After getting a Diet Coke and a handful of animal crackers, I settled in on my lounge boy chair to read the mail. In the mail was her statement from her private credit card bank. For no particular reason, I opened it. Perhaps I was looking for one of the numerous, sometimes interesting commercial offers for unneeded trinkets that accompany the payment due statement. I perused her short list of bills. One caught my eye. It was a bill from a local third-rank motel for a one-day charge. I looked again and saw a series of dates and charges for the same motel. I had no idea what this was all about. I got up to go to my den to check my work calendar. The charges were all on Wednesdays of last month. I gasped as I then checked my day planner. I had been in town every one of those days, working in an emergency room on a noon to midnight second coverage shift. Janet had also not left town. She had been home when I arrived shortly after midnight, every early Thursday morning. Something in my gut squeezed down on me. I could not think of a reason for these bills other than sinister infidelity happenings. Never in my worst nightmares could this scenario occur, yet here it was staring me in the face. The statement mocked me as if laughing at my trust in my wife. My first reaction was to look to see if this was only last month. I knew where she kept her statements, in a desk drawer in the master bedroom. She made no special effort to hide these. I guess that helped my trust in her. I had no reason to look at them and therefore had not done so before. Her drawer where she kept the past statements was my next stop. She obviously trusted me not to look at her statements as they were neatly filed and easily accessible in the second left drawer. I got out the previous month's statement. Yepers. Every week there was a bill from the motel. Usually it was a Wednesday, but not always. I compared the dates with my work calendar, and each was when I was either out of town overnight or working until midnight. Finding the months previous, I verified that there were another 4 weekly bills from the same motel. I went back to the January statement some 8 months ago. There, to my dismay and horror, were 3 weekly bills from the very same motel. Also, there was a bill from a 4-star restaurant for over $100. Meals and alcoholic beverages itemized. I was sure that I had not eaten there with her. The bill was too large for just one person, so she had paid for at least 2 people's dinner. I had a pattern of bills at a motel. Janet had not told me anything about these. I had no reason to question her until now, as I knew nothing about them. Tonight I was going to confront her and get an explanation. I put everything back in place and went to my den and computer to try to make sense of all this. Already I knew the answer but had to get her to verify it. I had to make plans immediately and set about doing what was needed. I got my suitcases from the attic along with 2 clothes bags. I put these in my bedroom closet as I figured last night was my last night in this house with her. I ordered pizza and salad to be delivered. The table was set with our good china and real silverware along with candles and wine glasses. I straightened up the great room and cleaned the kitchen. My nervous actions allowed me to do something with my hands while my heart and mind raced in 1,000 directions. My perfect life had come to a crushing end. My trust had been misplaced. I wondered for how long this had been going on. The whys and whos overwhelmed my mind into a numbed sense of nothingness. Obviously, our lives had become untwined, and now I was floating around in life without my mooring. After all, she was home and life to me. I heard a car come up the driveway. The doorbell rang, so I knew it was pizza delivery. He left, leaving me with a hot pizza, cold salad and a bottle of chilled Chardonnay. The wine went into the cleaned refrigerator, the pizza into the warming oven and the salads into 2 dishes in the refrigerator ready for serving. I heard my wife's car arrive as the garage doors opened then shut. She was in the house as I welcomed her with a warm hug and kiss. For a moment, I forgot anything could be bad between us. Having her in my arms was my life and my home. The dark thoughts crashed back in and I disentangled from her arms, pushing her away gently but definitely. Janet. I tried not to let my voice waver. I have a pizza dinner for us tonight. Go wash up as I serve it all up. What's the special event, John? She inquired with a twinkle in her eye. Just go wash up, Janet. I urged her as I turned toward the kitchen. I checked for her latest credit card statement still in my trousers pocket to be sure I had it. We sat and enjoyed the pizza, salad and wine. I poured a second glass for myself and offered her a fill-up which she took. I rarely had a second glass but tonight I felt the need. You are outdoing yourself, John. She giggled. You never have a second glass and here you are turning out to be a real alcoholic. She giggled and lightly kicked me under the table. We bantered lightly as we finished the meal. Let's clean up and have a coffee, Janet. I have a little light dessert and a subject for conversation. We cleaned the table. We put the excess pizza into the oven and corked the wine for the refrigerator. The coffee was brewed and I produced some light little dolly cake squares. I knew these were her favorite dessert. I didn't particularly like them. They tasted too artificial for me but were perfect for tonight. I thought, sweet on the outside. She liked them, but I was revolted by the inside taste. It reminded me of what might be coming in a moment or two. Usually when we have a subject to discuss, we sit next to each other on the couch. This time, knowing it was going to be a confrontation, not a problem-solving discussion, I suggested we sit at the table again, facing each other. We sipped coffee as she dug into her tiny piece of sugar-coated cake. I had no taste for these and didn't even break one open with my fork. I just diddled with it, feeling increasingly nervous. Reaching into my pocket, I produced the envelope from her credit card bank. I took out the statement, unfolded it and said, "This came today." I opened it. I have never done this before, but I guess a little voice was telling me to take a look at it. "Janet, you have way overdrawn your account." I had an awful feeling as I flattened the statement out facing her and pointed to the weekly motel bills. "I fear you have not overdrawn your credit card. It is our trust and marriage account that has been overdrawn." I looked at her intently. She looked at the statement. I had caught her red-handed. She is quick-witted but didn't have an immediate explanation. I continued, "Janet, I checked your other monthly statements going back to January of this year. I can clearly see charges from this same motel almost weekly over the entire year. There are other very suspicious charges also." I took a long breath and sat back in my chair looking her straight in the eyes. "I just want you to be honest with me about these. I have a right and need to know the truth." She took a long slow breath and began, "John, I want you to know that I love you very much. I also want to stay married to you. Yes, I have a lover. He is now a first-year resident at the university. We have fallen in love." She began to cry. "At first we just talked. He was a student on a junior preceptorship with the group where I work. At first he reminded me physically so much of you 20 years ago when we first met. He made me feel young again. Things progressed. How much do you want to know tonight, John?" "Lots more." I spoke firmly. "He comes from a broken family and never really had a mother after his grade school years. I guess I became his surrogate mother for a while. Then we became like friends, then the intimacies began. For the year we have been frequent sexual partners. I taught him almost everything about sex. I brought experience and he brought youth, vigor and an aggressive style to our sex lives. Oh John, I'm not sorry at all for what I'm doing. I just hope that you will be understanding. I need the both of you in my life. I know how awful this sounds, but it is so awesome to me. My sex life has been so wonderful with him. He is an alpha male. He is a true dominant and I have truly loved being his sub. You know that I like to be the aggressive one in the sex life you and I share. You never dominated me. You never hurt me or struck me or did anything even close to that. You never used nasty language when we made love. He calls me his witch and 304. When I am with him sexually he owns my body and my heart also. All these are an aphrodisiac to me now. I expect you can't understand that, but it's true. When he and I became lovers, he immediately became the dominant and I had to submit. I was afraid at first, but then I learned to love being his truly submissive sub. The only thing I have refused him is to refuse sex to you. He demanded this, but I stood firm on that point. The only bad thing has been the cover-up on you. I never lied to you, but I never told you either. I have not left you for him, so I haven't broken our promises we made when we got married. I have been here for you for 20 years. She wasn't crying any longer. She was just explaining something to me as if she had found a new dress that she loved and hadn't told me about. I had not expected her to just come forward and answer the question before I asked them. She was being upfront with me. "Janet, has he been in our house? Have you had sex with him here in my sanctuary?" "Yes, John. I didn't invite him. He demanded to come here and take me. He said this house is now his and I belong to him. Of course I don't actually belong to him all the time. It's only when we are together." I was sitting mad. She had made me into a chicken and cuck. I was heartbroken but had not given in. Not by a long shot. No damn arrogant surgeon was going to do that. They may denigrate us docs, but I won't let him humiliate me with my family. No way was that going to happen. I almost spit these at her. My body tightened and I glared in hatred at her for the first time in my life. "Janet. I looked at her and reached out to take her hand across the table. If you break this off immediately, I will try my very best to keep our marriage intact. Will you do that? You must be forceful and truthful to him about never seeing him again alone for any reason. Will you call him right now while I am on the phone with you and tell him it is all over between you? Oh, John. Please don't say that. You don't know how much I love him and how much he loves me. I love you too. I need both of you. Janet. My voice took on a more threatening and angry tone. There is no option as far as I can see it. You will do this, or our marriage is over as of tonight. I will not continue to share you sexually with anyone, male or female. You know how I have always felt about this. We have 20+ years and 2 children together. Are you going to throw these away? My life will be destroyed. I will be adrift in life without the only woman I have ever loved and trusted. Please tell me and show me that I am your real man. I waited, but she just shook her head sadly, looking down at the table. I got up from the table. I put my hands under the table and lifted it up, turning it on top of her. She fell backward with the tabletop on top of her. She screamed in fright. I stomped off to the bedroom and finished packing in silence. I heard her pushing the table off her body. I went to the bedroom door and locked it. I didn't want to talk to her anymore. It took me only a few minutes to complete what I needed from the bedroom. I was seething in rage. Unlocking the door, I found her sitting on the floor across from the bedroom door waiting for me. She had been crying but had quit. I didn't offer to help her up. Walking past her, I told her I would be back in a few minutes to get a few things more from my den. The 2 suitcases, the hanging bag, and I made it to the garage and into my car. Returning to my den, I put my laptop into its carrying case along with several external memory chips and a stack of CDs. Next came all my financial files, which I put into a cardboard box. I included files on the house and my car. I removed the side from my tower computer and removed the hard drive. Next came some of my more needed medical books. These went into the trunk. As I came back, Janet was still sitting on the floor in the hall where she had been sitting, as if in a trance. She had pushed the table off her. I grabbed her and dragged her to the bedroom, which was a mess by now. I was not careful to pick up after myself as I usually did. I pushed her onto the bed, then pulled her up to a sitting position. I stood in front of her. I intended to dominate her physically and emotionally if at all possible. Janet, I am out of your life as of right now. You can have all you want of your new Dr. Lover boy. I hope he will take care of you as well as I have. I hope you don't do to him what you have done to me. I will find somewhere else to live. You will hear from my yet-to-be-found divorce lawyer in a few days. I have my cell phone and will listen to any messages you have for me. I won't promise to return your calls, and I don't plan to let you know where I am staying for the time being. Oh yeah, you can have the rest of the pizza and wine. My life is going to be filled with new wine. I will not tell you goodbye or goodnight, for good is not in my vocabulary when I think of you anymore. I turned and left her and my 20-some years of shared life and family. I found a motel for the night, then moved into a furnished mobile home. I did all the things that every recovering male does. The credit cards were canceled and reissued. I took her off my bank account. I took care of all the other financial things, including my will and IRA and 501c3c. With heaviness of heart, yet with my anger not yet fully controlled, I met with a divorce lawyer. He did nothing to encourage me. I had no proof, so I was going to lose big time. I told him I didn't care. Give her half of everything and all the equity in the house, with the stipulation that her lover would never be able to enjoy the house ownership. I would not pay alimony. That part was non-negotiable. Never more would I support her. She had her own business and her lover was a doctor. He understood and started the papers. I asked him to give me the completed papers to serve on her when he had filed them. Janet and I were legally separated upon filing the divorce papers. I continued to work and put my income into a third secret bank account. This made no sense really, as it could be discovered easily, but it made me feel better. She would have to look for it. I was not going to cooperate at any level on anything regarding her. I called the kids and told them what had happened. I minced not words, giving them enough details to convince them I was right and she was totally wrong. They called her and told her they were divorcing her. She would not be their mother anymore. I didn't care if she was hurt. I called her parents and mine and told them the same true story in as much detail as they wanted. A week later, the divorce papers were filed and I had my copy to take to her. My lawyer said he would formally serve her that evening at 8 p.m. I called Janet from my mobile home. She answered right off. "Janet, I am coming over tonight at 7:30 to talk. If you want to talk, this is going to be your opportunity. If you don't want to talk, then I'm coming over to talk to you anyway. John, you are welcome. This is your home and you belong here. Can I fix dinner for you?" "No, Janet. If we have coffee and some fruit, that will be enough." I hung up before she could say anything else. She was trying to say something, but I had no need to listen to her. I grabbed a 6-inch Subway and diet drink on the way that evening. I had the papers in my pocket as I rang the doorbell. Janet opened the door and I walked in. She did not try to hug or kiss me, which I thought was very unlike her, but we were separated, so maybe she was really done with me. I hurt but quickly recovered. "John, I have someone here who wants to meet you." I looked at a young man with a scraggly goatee and a sneering grin. He was easily 6 feet 4 inches, and 230 pounds. Next to my dainty 5 feet 2 inches wife. He toured over her and me too. I was only 5 feet 7 inches, and a meager 145 pounds. I glared at him, for I knew who he was automatically. Janet had not said she wanted me to meet him. Only that he wanted to meet me. I was physically afraid of him. Quickly my mind turned to means of self-defense if needed. I had never boxed and knew nothing of the martial arts. I was a doctor, pure and simple. I helped people, not fought with them. I remembered the snub-nose .38 caliber I kept under my old underwear in my bedroom. It should still be there. He approached me menacingly. "Who are you and what are you doing in my house with my wife here tonight? Janet and I need to be alone to talk of difficult matters, so I'm asking you to leave quietly and peacefully now. John, this is Dr. Sparks. He demanded to be here tonight. I had no choice but to allow him to stay. You know of our relationship?" Janet replied assertively. He kept walking toward me. He had not extended a hand, nor did I. We glared at each other. I backed to the wall as he advanced. My heart was pounding in fear. "You both must excuse me for a moment. I need to pee." I scurried down the hall to my bedroom. It had been recently used. There were ropes attached to the 4 corners of the bed. The sheets were messed up. There was the smell of sex in the room. Janet had been having sex just before I arrived, and a hole wasn't about to leave without humiliating me. I vowed to myself that I would die or spend my life in prison before that would happen today. Quickly I found my snub-nose 38 and checked it. It had 6 rounds. I moved the safety door off and slid it in my right pocket. I returned to the front room. Both of them were seated on my couch. I looked at my watch and it was 5 minutes to 8. 5 more minutes until the deputy would arrive to serve the divorce papers. I wanted my timing to be perfect and was hoping the deputies would be also. "Okay, Janet. You wanted your lover here, so here we go." I walked to the couch. He started to get up, but I shoved him back onto the couch. "You had your invitation to leave, a-hole. Now get this right. You don't own me. You are not welcome here in my house. You do what I say. If you are ready to leave peacefully, then you have your last chance. I suggest you take it." He jumped up as I moved back rapidly to avoid him. "So you are the little weak chicken who thinks he owns this beautiful piece of female, huh? She has had a real man screw her. That's me. And she wants me. Look at me, woman, and tell me you want me." He glared at me, then looked at Janet. She sat there. Her hands twitched as her husband and lover glared at each other. "Yes, I want you, Dr. Sparks, and I want John too. Don't call me Dr. Sparks, witch. My name is Master to you. Now tell me you want me as your real man. I know chicken here has smelled what used to be his bedroom. Tell me which." "Yes, Master," she faltered as she looked at me. "A-hole, the exit door is to your right. Take it and live. You may not walk out of here alive otherwise. That is not a threat. It is a solemn promise. I glared at the hunk standing some 6 feet from me. I threw the divorce papers at Janet. You adulteress, you are served. These are divorce papers. You will soon be free of me. I looked at a hole. That's what you wanted, isn't it? Looking back at Janet, I gritted my teeth and said, you threw me away. You humiliated me. You lost your children. Your parents have disowned you, and all for a hunk of worthless shit standing over here. I nodded toward a hole. You wanted and loved being dominated. You wanted to be made into a 304. He will turn you into a common witch. I know his kind. They are arrogant. They think the world revolves around them. He will screw you silly and then throw you away. Then what will you have? I could see the burning anger in his eyes. Get out of my house. I yelled at him as he advanced on me. I backed up to the wall. I had nowhere else to go. I slipped my hands into my pants and fingered the gun. I would not fight him on his terms. My hands were useless and the source of my income. He was too arrogant to give any thought that his hands might be injured. My right index finger slid around the trigger, but I didn't pull it or point it at him. I did not want him to know that I had protection. You slimeball of a chicken. He growled at me. You are mincemeat. This is my house and my woman. Now you are going to be my man. He smiled a snarl and took another step closer to me. My heart was racing. I wanted him to touch me first. I sneaked a look at Janet, but she did not come to my defense. She sat rigid as in a trance. Janet! I started over at her for a moment. Call 911 right now and ask for an ambulance and the police on a stat basis. Slimeball here is going to the hospital or the morgue. I looked back at him. I sneered at him. Okay, elephant balls, better leave now. This is the third and final warning. You are trespassing. If you touch me you commit assault, and if you hurt me you commit battery. That means jail time. So what will it be? I am not in charge here. Get out or get hurt badly. Then I whispered to him. You are all bluster. When a real man like me stands up to a slimeball like you, you just melt like a snowball in July. You are pathetic. You chicken. I was going to tie you up like my witch loves them. Screw you, but now I've decided to beat your butt in balls. If you have any, then screw what is left, providing there is anything left to screw. I'm going to have your balls for dinner. He balled up his fists and jabbed a right at me. I jerked my head to the left, but he caught me with a glancing blow to my left eye. His fist hit the wall and broke a hole in it. I felt the sting, but he missed mostly. From there on things were a blur. I pointed the gun up from within my pocket and pulled off a single round. The blast deafened me, or was it his left fist hitting me square on the nose as I pulled the trigger again? I had kept both hands in my pockets. I dropped to the floor mostly unconscious. I heard the door break open as a brown-clad officer entered with Janet's formal divorce papers falling to the floor as he pulled his service revolver. Young Dr. Sparks lay partly on my rug, but spread mostly across the table that was last used by me to throw over Janet. He was screaming obscenities and holding his crotch. I heard sirens approaching as I laid on the floor, wandering in and out of consciousness. I woke up in the emergency room I frequently staffed. I was receiving VIP treatment. A hole was in surgery. I was admitted to the hospital for observation. Apparently, as I fell, I had also hit my head and suffered a concussion. The hospital didn't want to lose one of their ER docs. I was out of the hospital in 24 hours, feeling well except for sore muscles and a badly bruised and broken nose that had been straightened and bandaged. Mouth breathing is a bugger, but I would be free of the nostril stuffing in another few days when the swelling began to go down. All in all, I fared pretty well. My ego was intact. I thought, not a bad day for a chicken cuck. I grinned as I left in a taxi for my mobile home. Janet was served. Young Dr. Sparks lost most of his penis. Seems a .38 slug at close range hitting him dead on and just below the pelvic bone had destroyed his future abilities for erections and children. He had had to have a diversionary colostomy and extensive rectal, pelvic, and bladder surgery. I smiled as I heard of his injuries. He lost a testicle too. He may never urinate from his penis again, and most likely will never defecate from his rectum. Erections for him were a part of his past. I was satisfied. I thought again, yes, not a bad day's work for a cuck chicken. I had to appear before the grand jury but was not indicted. Janet and the deputy testified for me. I set up a confrontation with Janet but she upped the ante. I tried to avoid the ensuing conflict with her lover but could not. A man is allowed to defend himself from serious bodily harm in his own house in our state. The divorce went on as anticipated. I gave the house to Janet with the stipulation that young a-hole, Dr. Sparks, could never set foot in it again, and would never inherit it or have any financial interest in it. Ultimately he lost his medical license also. Jane's demons set her free of me and her family. I pay no alimony. To her credit, Janet would not allow her lawyer to ask for alimony. She was still a cocky lady. I could not stand to stay in the same community as her. I would see her and it would light up old feelings of anger, disgust, loneliness and yes, happy memories. So here I am in beautiful semi-rural southwest England, alone with my hurts and memories. The phone rang. It was my son's weekly call. It was good to hear their voices and appreciate the Southern American drawl. I had been here only a short while and I was already homesick. Then I remembered I have no home. I divorced her.
Now start second story.
Do you ever get the feeling that you've climbed so high that the only way left to go is down? That's how I've been feeling lately. Stuck atop some mountain with only a rough downhill path ahead. The view isn't even nice anymore. Just fog or dark clouds in every direction I look. It just leaves me feeling lost and sad. It wasn't always like this, or at least not when I had Marianne. I thought she was the best thing to ever happen to me. And maybe she was for a while. Now that she's gone, just when I thought I had finally made it, I find myself back where I started. Alone. Losing her wouldn't be so bad if I didn't always end up back on these damn mountains whenever I fall. I initially encountered Marianne, though she preferred not to be called Mary, at a fundraiser for wildlife preservation in Seattle early in the spring. At that time I was a young biologist, relatively attractive, and had recently graduated, working for the National Park System in the Northern Cascades of northern Washington state. My expertise lay in bears, and I gave a brief presentation at the fundraiser about the new Recovery Area project, aimed at facilitating the resurgence of the highly endangered grizzly bear population in the southern 48 states. While they thrived in Alaska, their presence south of Canada was scant. Not everyone embraced the notion of an 8-foot-tall apex predator residing near their backyard, potentially lurking around campsites during hiking, fishing, or skiing trips. However, this environmentally conscious group of potential donors proved to be a receptive and well-off audience, and my supervisor secured substantial funding. I received commendation and accrued some favor, earning a gold star in my personnel file that read collaborates effectively. During budget allocations, they tend to favor a competent scientist who also possesses social graces and is willing to occasionally don a suit over a more brilliant but difficult colleague who protests vehemently against engaging with the public. While fieldwork might be the enjoyable part, the true essence of our work lies in garnering public support and the necessary funding behind the scenes to sustain our efforts. The evening brought success on various fronts. I acquired the phone number of an exceptionally appealing young blonde, fresh out of college, studying art history, and already weary of the local social scene. She seemed to view a rugged young field biologist, complete with a scruffy beard, as an intriguing and romantic character. She possessed qualities that contrasted sharply with mine. She was assertive to the point of aggression, exceedingly wealthy and thoroughly disinterested in everything and everyone around her, largely due to her short attention span. In essence, we had little in common, yet that didn't hinder us from enjoying each other's company for a while, particularly in the bedroom. Initially, it was expected to be a brief and harmless romance. We'd have occasional outings, some fun, and then inevitably part ways as she sought someone else to occupy her time more permanently. However, things didn't unfold that way. Despite my limited visits to Seattle only once a month to see her, it oddly suited her schedule perfectly. Somehow, against the odds, our relationship flourished. Marianne visited me at the national park several times that summer. She experienced the public side of things, observing campers engaging in boating, fishing, and hiking activities. I also took her on extensive hikes to show her the areas where I worked, giving her a clear picture of my profession, collecting bear scat for analysis, tracking GPS tag bears to monitor their activities, and studying the behavior of both tagged and untagged bears for our database. From the beginning, it was evident that Marianne wasn't accustomed to nature. Her previous experiences had been limited to staying in 3-star hotels without amenities like room service or hair dryers. She struggled with hiking, the harsh mountain weather, and the abundance of insects. I hoped that exposing her to the reality of my less glamorous job would dispel any romantic notions she had about it, but it didn't seem to make much of a difference. She still viewed me as a more intelligent version of a park ranger, and assumed that, like the bears, I'd have plenty of free time to entertain her once the park closed for the winter. I don't think she ever fully grasped that winter was consistently one of my busiest times of the year. During those months, I'd be immersed in processing 6 months' worth of bear waste, charting nutritional data, cataloging film, and transcribing behavioral observations. Not to mention enduring weeks of trekking in harsh winter conditions, scaling icy mountains, and meticulously documenting the hibernation sites of every GPS-tagged bear in the entire park. I'll admit I was somewhat tunnel-visioned too. I love my job, but her genuine appreciation for it added an extra layer of excitement. Recognition is scarce in my field, so her support and partial comprehension meant a lot to me. It seemed like none of her other affluent friends did anything truly meaningful with their lives. Sure, they donated to trendy eco-causes like the Recovery Project, but I was actually out there, actively making a difference, not just paying lip service. I knew I wouldn't become wealthy, and I was convinced that this was ultimately how her social circle judged success or failure. Despite her romantic ideals, one day she would realize I was a failure in life. I would eventually be labeled a loser in her book, and that sense of failure would become a permanent part of my life, driving her away. Despite all odds and against everyone's better judgment, Marianne and I tied the knot that August. She had the grand church wedding that probably cost more than my annual salary, yet wouldn't dent her father's discretionary spending. Afterwards, we hosted a more intimate reception in the park for the rangers and park staff. Following that, we embarked on a 2-week trip to the Caribbean, where we both suffered from severe sunburns, endured food poisoning, and lost my prized Nikon digital camera to a thief. Despite these mishaps, it was still the most enjoyable time of my life. Unbeknownst to me at the time, Marianne was under immense pressure from her family to marry someone. Anyone. A significant portion of her substantial family trust fund was contingent upon her marrying before the age of 25, a condition set by her conservative aunt who disapproved of unmarried, independent young women. It later became apparent that Marianne was still reeling from the departure of her former lover, Dennis, who had left for New York to work at his uncle's commodities trading firm. Only later did I realize that Dennis, not me, was Marianne's true love. I merely served as a temporary distraction and safeguarded her inheritance until his potential return. Our honeymoon represented the apex of our marriage. Much like the glaciers on the east side of the park's mountains where snow fell heavily and the sun rarely appeared, our relationship gradually chilled and moved downhill. I believe Marianne expected to socialize with the wives of the park rangers and other seasonal staff, while I was away at work for several days at a time. However, she may not have realized that rangers typically marry within their own circles or connect with scientists if they marry at all. Our community tends to consist of unique individuals leading unconventional lives, attracting independent and sometimes introverted employees. The remaining spouses often work full-time at the park or volunteer at visitor centers. People in the wilderness find fulfilling activities to keep themselves occupied. Otherwise, they might succumb to cabin fever. For a period, she attempted some volunteer work, but her commitment was lacking. She didn't attend regularly, only showing up sporadically when she felt particularly bored, which didn't contribute much. I tried taking her with me into the field, but it became bothersome for both of us. She incessantly talked while we were out on the trail, hindering any chance of studying bears, especially since black bears are very wary of people. Camping and roughing it out were not her forte. She struggled with even basic camping tasks like setting up camp or cooking over a fire. In fact, she lacked most domestic skills altogether, even in our own cabin. Then she narrowly escaped a dangerous encounter with Grumpy Gertie, which extinguished any remaining faint appreciation she may have once had for life in the great outdoors. Late autumn poses one of the highest risks for encountering bears, especially older ones. During this time, They frantically search for food before hibernating for the winter. Older bears, often slower and less nourished, become increasingly desperate for a last-minute meal. It's a rare occasion when the typically timid black bear can turn aggressive towards humans, and brown bears, grizzlies, like the perennially ill-tempered old sow Gertie, can become deadly predators. Gertie had recently given birth to her final litter of cubs this year, and one of the earliest lessons for inexperienced campers is understanding that a mother bear sow with cubs is incredibly dangerous. Marianne and I were in the midst of crossing a small stream when, from the trees and thick brush on the opposite side, 2 lively cubs emerged, curious about our presence and eager for a drink. I urgently instructed Marianne to step back immediately and find a tree to climb on our side of the stream, but she hesitated. Finding the cubs adorable, she might have attempted to approach them if I hadn't firmly stopped her. Any notion she had about grizzly bears being cute vanished when grumpy Gertie emerged from the trees, fixing her menacing gaze upon us as she joined her cubs. I possessed a rifle and legally I could have shot Gertie. She was a well-known threat with a history of trouble. However, her cubs were still too young to fend for themselves in the wilderness, especially without their mother to prepare a den for the winter. I had a few other options, but none were particularly favorable. Marianne's panicked screams only escalated the situation, especially when Gertie began charging toward her. Bears are swift creatures, faster than most humans. Trying to outrun them isn't effective, especially if you start too late as Marianne did. So I had only one recourse. To intercept Gertie's path and douse her face thoroughly with bear repellent, a potent pepper spray with added deterrence designed to capture a bear's full attention. I never venture from my cabin without it. It did the trick. Gertie reacted poorly to the spray, swiping at me with a force that could have been fatal had I still been upright. Instead, I dropped to the ground playing dead, the only sensible response when a bear approaches closely. Usually, they lose interest quickly, preferring not to engage unless desperate for food. Gertie, blinded and in pain from the spray, fled in the opposite direction, howling in anger. Marianne never forgave me, and seldom ventured far from the safety of the park's living quarters thereafter. It was a harsh and lonely winter, both inside and outside the cabin. By the time spring arrived, our relationship remained frosty, and Marianne had spent the long winter mostly drinking and sulking right from the moment she woke up. Despite the poor TV reception in our area, even the new satellite dish barely provided her with any distraction. As early summer approached, she began spending more time back in Seattle, resuming her usual socializing on the cocktail circuit. By autumn, I was lucky to see her 3 or 4 days a month, and our intimate life had dwindled to nearly nothing. Just before most of the major roads closed for winter, Marianne declared that she wouldn't be spending the winter at the park this year, choosing instead to stay firmly rooted in Seattle. This was the moment I should have faced reality and initiated divorce proceedings. It was painfully clear that our relationship had run its course. She was going to leave me, likely for good. I had become the loser in her eyes, a fate I had always feared would come to pass. It seemed that my luck wasn't about to change for the better any time soon. During that extended winter, I kept myself entertained by tallying how frequently my wife's photograph graced the society section of the Seattle Times. I ceased counting after the occurrence. As in the last 3 snapshots, she was consistently beside the same individual, a certain Dennis Henry. Never trust a man with 2 first names, my father used to say, and he was likely correct. At least my wife wasn't depleting much if any of my finances. There isn't much to purchase in the Cascades, and my government's salary pales in comparison to her trust fund income. This left me with ample funds to engage a private investigator in Seattle to monitor my wife while she was away. I harbored no desire to claim any portion of her wealth in a divorce settlement. I simply yearned to ascertain if she was being unfaithful so that I could insist upon a divorce and move on with my life. The uncertainty of waiting in the darkness and snow was the most agonizing sensation I had ever experienced, and by the arrival of spring, my morale had plummeted considerably. I was beginning to feel quite the loser myself. I would have been glad to receive my wife's call in early April informing me of her return, had I not already received a comprehensive report from my private investigator outlining her numerous affairs with Dennis, who now seemed to be living with her full-time at her luxury condo in Seattle. Despite her claims of love and longing over the phone, her drunken declaration to Dennis in a high-end bar that she wished for my demise, urgently and as an accident, raised questions. Although she professed a desire to salvage our relationship, her recent activities, including extensive research on bears at the library and meetings with bear keepers at the Seattle Zoo, hinted otherwise. These actions, not aimed at preventing bear attacks, involved inquiries on how to provoke such incidents instead. The image forming in my mind from these unsettling bits of information wasn't sitting well with me. My PI had reached a similar conclusion, but the law enforcement agencies we approached basically said they couldn't intervene until Marianne made a concrete attempt to harm me. Why did Marianne suddenly want me dead, preferably in a freak bear encounter? What was driving her? I was more than ready, even eager, to divorce her on almost any terms. That was the first thing I asked her when she reappeared in my life. Do you want a divorce? I'm ready to give it to you, no fuss or trouble. I won't take a penny of your money. You're clearly not happy in this life and we're both just making each other miserable. We're both wandering blindly in this mist atop a mountain, where all paths lead downward, some more treacherous than others, some are so perilous that it's just a matter of time before we tumble straight off a cliff. But there's one path that's relatively safe and straightforward, and it's called divorce. It might not be a joyful path, but it's a stable and secure one that will eventually lead us both back home, to start ascending again some other day. That's the path before us now, so why don't we just take it? The situation was somewhat complex, but I had been tuned in to the local country music station all morning, feeling a tad poetic and nostalgic. I was offering her an opportunity for a peaceful separation, devoid of bitterness, legal battles, and hopefully violence. I pleaded with her silently to agree to the settlement and let go of any other plans she might have had for her freedom. For a brief moment I thought I had persuaded her. She hesitated and deliberated for a while, but ultimately stuck to her predetermined course, attempting to convince me of her love, albeit mostly avoiding direct eye contact. She was a terrible liar, yet I pretended to entertain the idea of reconciliation. We even engaged in intimate relations for the first time in months. It was surprisingly satisfying but ultimately built on falsehoods. I remained vigilant, keeping a close eye on my surroundings and possessions, but it wasn't quite enough. Her exceedingly subtle scheme to end my life came dangerously close to succeeding. I didn't have to wait long for my accident to happen, but it unfolded in an unexpected manner. From my professional knowledge, there was no such thing as a bear attractor besides the scent of fresh meat, so unless I stumbled upon some bloody steaks in my pack, I figured I could easily avoid that particular problem. Hunting is strictly prohibited in our national park, so I could confidently dismiss the possibility of a hunting accident or being mistakenly shot. Such an occurrence would be highly unusual and would prompt a thorough FBI investigation, a perk of being a government employee. I was primarily concerned about sudden damage to my climbing equipment, as falls from the steep mountains in this area are not uncommon. However, her planned accident for me took an unexpected turn. Death by chapstick lip balm. If you were to compile a list of 100 innocent and useful items for a hiking or skiing trip, it's likely that plain chapstick would make it onto everyone's list. According to some common beliefs in urban legends, bears are attracted to its smell, possibly due to the high beeswax content. On my first day out since Marianne returned, I unexpectedly encountered a record number of bears. This might have been because Marianne had generously applied about 200 tubes of chapstick all over my backpack, jacket and boots, though I couldn't detect any scent myself. Regardless, I unwittingly attracted every black bear within miles. Encountering bears in April was not uncommon, as they emerge from hibernation hungry and forage extensively. Even typically shy black bears become more tolerant of people during this time. These particular bears seemed unusually tolerant of my presence, often approaching much closer than usual. While older bears may have recognized my scent and categorized me as harmless, not worth eating, it appeared that all of them took a special interest in me. Fortunately, despite their curiosity, none attempted to determine if I was edible. I hadn't given it much thought until Grumpy Gertie tracked me down. In her twisted mind, I was probably labeled as extremely annoying, possibly delicious, worth investigating soon. Gertie caught wind of me and decided today was a good day to settle some old scores. She cornered me not far from my cabin, near a small clearing along a trail with a steep rocky outcrop on one side and a rough, nearly vertical slope on the other. I didn't fancy my chances of scrambling down that slope, it would be more like a controlled fall. I figured a good dose of bear repellent might improve Gertie's disposition. But there was a hitch. My can, which should have been full, was now completely empty. Now it was time to hunker down and hope for the best. My rifle was slung over my shoulder, but there was no time to even consider using it. I curled up into a fetal position, shielding my head and avoiding eye contact with the enraged bear as much as possible. Playing dead usually does the trick, and it did this time too, mostly because there was something enticing about my backpack. It seemed she wanted that as her first course. Gertie had a lot of fun at first, pounding my motionless body and trying to rip the backpack off my shoulders. I had to move carefully, but I managed to free my hands from the straps just enough for Gertie to completely rip off my backpack with a few more blows and throw it down a steep, almost sheer slope. Then she was faced with a choice, either eat me or rush after my backpack, but the backpack seemed much more attractive to her and she rushed after it. My back was slightly scratched, I had a wound on my left hip and there were bite marks on the back of my arms and on my neck where she tried to wring my neck, but fortunately the backpack mostly protected me there. I didn't wait for her to return and quickly left before Gertie showed the slightest desire to follow me. At the first opportunity, one stopped to take a refreshing bath with ice water to wash off any remaining odors and treat my foot, although I suspected that whatever fragrance was used for labeling it was mostly on my backpack. I cleaned my shoes clean of dirt but noticed that my jacket, getting wet, became surprisingly waterproof, so I reluctantly buried it. Everything else seemed to be in decent condition. I slowly hobbled home and didn't see any more bears. I hadn't fully decided how to handle my unfaithful and murderous wife yet, but I concluded that my first step would be to locate a ranger who could then contact either the park police, the county sheriff, or a federal marshal, or all three. Crimes in national parks can become complicated quickly. They say park rangers are never around when you need them, except for lighting illegal fires or hunting in the wrong places, but there was one here and now waiting in front of my cabin. I had unfortunate news for him, and it seemed he had even worse news for me. While my affectionate wife was pretending to reconcile with me, her lover Dennis, who had come along on this trip for immoral support, had set up camp at the nearest campground by our cabin to wait for her. He was no novice camper and was doing fine until Marianne, his lover, arrived at his camp shortly after I left for my daily hike, carrying a bag with about 200 empty chapstick tubes. She didn't want to discard the evidence here. It would raise suspicion as to why she needed so much lip protection. So, she emptied them into a trash bag to take back to Seattle for discreet disposal. She never got the chance. Grumpy Gertie found them first. My memory of the exact sequence of events is a bit fuzzy, but according to the rangers investigating the incident and an FBI team that arrived later in the day, Marianne went straight to her lover as soon as I was out of sight of our cabin. They were in Dennis's tent, completely undressed, enthusiastically celebrating what they thought would be their success. Then Gertie stumbled upon their camp, lured by the scent of chapstick tubes. If they had stayed quiet, they might have been okay. But Marianne, terrified of bears, especially Gertie, screamed loudly. Gertie, being mean and perhaps more intelligent than the average bear, recognized Marianne's scream and decided to seek revenge and a meal. After satisfying her hunger temporarily, she followed the scent trail to my cabin and eventually tracked me down. Fortunately, there was at least one witness who survived to confirm the important details. Dennis managed to survive the brutal attack, although he was badly mauled and left permanently disabled. His ability to play dead likely saved his life until Gertie left. Marianne, however, bore the brunt of Gertie's rage and hunger and did not fare as well. Her remains necessitated a closed-casket funeral, a tragic end to her ordeal. I found myself officially widowed, and somewhat unexpectedly, I inherited a significant fortune from my late wife's estate. Despite the court's ruling that her death was accidental, occurring while she was attempting to murder me, her family and their team of lawyers disagreed. While I could have fought their claims through endless appeals, they seemed more interested in the money than I was. So, to bring peace to my life, I reached a settlement with them. I still received the majority of the estate, which was more money than I could ever spend in my lifetime. With a focus on my scientific endeavors, it would sustain me for years to come. For tax purposes, I established a scientific research foundation, which provides generous grants to me and a few associates each spring. Dennis eventually faced trial for his part in the horrifying ordeal, squarely placing the blame on his deceased partner, Mary Ann. However, the jury didn't sympathize much with the now wheelchair-bound man as he might have hoped. Nonetheless, he did reveal the elusive motive behind the crime: money. Mary Ann's late aunt strongly opposed divorce, and her estate stipulated that if Mary Ann divorced within 7 years of marriage, she'd lose half her trust fund. Initially willing to wait, Mary Ann changed her mind when Dennis returned early to Seattle. Together, they orchestrated a plan for an unfortunate accident involving the speaker. Dennis received a stiff initial sentence of 20 years to life, but his affluent family's resources and political connections led to appeals, resulting in him serving only about 7 years before release. However, justice as far as the speaker was concerned was served. Gertie ensured that Dennis would spend the rest of his life in a wheelchair, bearing the scars of his once handsome appearance. The speaker was satisfied. Justice had been served in their eyes. He didn't get to enjoy his newfound freedom for long. Soon after leaving prison, Dennis tied the knot with an attractive young blonde from a respectable family, but with limited finances. She was quickly labeled a gold digger, so when Dennis' wheelchair mysteriously ended up in the backyard pool, leading to his drowning, society wasn't too surprised. His devastated wife, who had been his caregiver, suddenly found herself wealthier, thanks to his assets and a hefty life insurance payout. Almost immediately she reunited with an old flame, and they're now living it up on a yacht in Florida. Sometimes karma works swiftly. As for Gertie, her days were numbered and she had her final meal. While I had intended to handle the hunt myself, that's what rangers are for. Besides, I was still recuperating in the hospital, undergoing observation after receiving numerous stitches. Despite being a clear violation of park rules and regulations, Gertie somehow ended up adorning my cabin's living room floor as a rug, purportedly classified as an antique on forged paperwork, thus circumventing the Protected Species Act. Though no one owned up to the deed, the guilty expressions on the rangers' faces suggested they were all accomplices. It seemed nobody was particularly fond of Gertie or Mary Ann, and most were probably relieved to see them gone while I returned to health and happiness. It's comforting to have supportive friends. I didn't stay a contented widower for too long. The following spring, a new young female biologist with a particular interest in bald eagles joined us, and we immediately hit it off. A year later I proposed to her a top mount challenger, and she instantly said yes. Now we spend all our time together in the fields, hills, and mountains, her eyes scanning the sky and mine focused on the ground. Together we make a formidable team. We're both content to live modestly in our wilderness cabin, dedicating ourselves to our biological research. Our faithful dog, Gertie, keeps us warm company on chilly winter nights when we're not passionately in love. We may not have much, but we have each other, and that's all we need. In fact, we have all the essentials for a fulfilling life.
Now start second story.
Life, sooner or later, will force the truth to come out. So if it seems to you that you will never be caught, then this is a deep misconception. My wife thought that I was naive, and that she would be able to keep her infidelity a secret. But life gave me circumstances that made me find out everything. On a stunning autumn afternoon, my daughter's high school soccer team commanded a 5-2 advantage against their fierce rivals, Frost, deep into the second half. Carrie, my youngest child, had netted 2 goals already, and seemed poised for a hat trick as she advanced down the field with only one defender and the goalie standing in her way. With bated breath, her mother and I cheered loudly as she closed in on the Frost goal. Carrie's golden ponytail danced behind her as she sprinted, executing a clever feint to the right before swiftly veering left, deftly switching the ball to her left foot. It appeared that all the investment we had made in soccer camps was about to yield returns once more when, in a last-ditch effort, the Frost defender, thoroughly outplayed, recklessly lunged at my daughter, sending her crashing to the ground. Twisting in midair, she bounced off the turf, coming to a halt after a couple of rolls. The referee promptly awarded a penalty, prompting both coaches to leap to their feet. I stood up in the stands, observing as Carrie clutched her right leg and let out a scream of pain. When the referee halted the game, I dashed onto the field to reach my daughter, who continued to cry out. Embracing her tightly, I watched as the team's trainer examined her leg. When Carrie screamed again, the trainer swiftly retrieved her phone and called for an ambulance. Holding her close, I comforted her while she sobbed. Soon after, my wife Tracy joined us on the field. Less than 5 minutes later, the ambulance arrived, pulling up to the group of adults surrounding Carrie. She was loaded into the vehicle and I followed, instructing my wife to meet us at the hospital. Upon arrival, Carrie was taken directly to X-ray. It was determined that her right fibula was broken, requiring orthopedic surgery to realign the bones, termed an open reduction. Carrie cried, realizing her sports season was over. Despite my efforts to console her, she remained inconsolable. While awaiting the arrival of an orthopedic specialist, a nurse examined the array of bruises Carrie had amassed on her legs throughout the season. It's not uncommon for soccer players to sport bruises, particularly on their legs given the physical nature of the sport. The nurse then turned her attention to the numerous bruises on Carrie's arms, prompting her to inquire about them. After questioning Carrie, the nurse conferred quietly with another colleague. Distracted by comforting a distressed 12-year-old, the narrator didn't fully register the whispered conversation at the time. A moment later, one of the two nurses who were whispering approached me and quietly inquired if I had observed any weight loss in Carrie. I had indeed noticed a slight decrease, but I assumed it was due to the vigorous activity involved in soccer games and practices. I nodded in acknowledgement and she returned to the other nurse, continuing their conversation in hushed tones. Shortly after, the orthopedic doctor arrived, reviewed the X-rays and began issuing instructions. Carrie was then taken to the operating room while Tracy and I proceeded to a waiting area. When Tracy and I were eventually permitted to join Carrie in the recovery room, she was still groggy. We stayed by her side for another 2 hours before heading home for the night. The doctor assured us that the operation had gone well and that we could bring our daughter home in a couple of days. The following day, I headed to my accounting job while Tracy remained at home, heading straight to the hospital to be with Carrie. About an hour into my workday, Tracy phoned me informing me that the doctor wanted to speak with both of us. I was puzzled. I thought the orthopedic surgeon had confirmed the success of the surgery. Perhaps there was something about rehabilitation he wanted to discuss. Upon arriving at my daughter's room, I kissed both Tracy and Carrie. Moments later, Dr. Ben Rao entered, which confused me since Carrie's orthopedic surgeon was Dr. James Rincon. Dr. Rao requested Tracy and I to join him in a small conference room. "What's the matter, doctor?" I inquired immediately. Dr. Rao lowered his gaze, took a deep breath, then looked back at us. I sensed then that the news wasn't going to be favorable. "We need to conduct further tests because we suspect Carrie may have leukemia," he stated softly. Tracy burst into tears and I suddenly felt as though I couldn't breathe. This news was perhaps the most devastating since my parents informed me of my maternal grandfather's passing when I was 12. Together with Dr. Rao, Tracy and I returned to Carrie's room to explain to her that the doctors needed to perform additional tests. We refrained from giving Carrie a specific reason, desperately hoping that we would never have to disclose the truth to her. We chose not to inform Carrie's older siblings about the doctor's suspicions, though we did inform them both that she was undergoing additional testing. Carrie's older brother Arnie, 19, a sophomore at Michigan State, was informed about the leg break and the extra testing over the phone. He offered to come home for a few days, but we reassured him it wasn't necessary, maintaining our optimism. However, Carrie's older sister, Ellie, 17, a junior in high school, could sense our concern despite our attempts to appear upbeat. Being the youngest in the family, Carrie, officially Karen, received plenty of attention, even from her siblings. Ellie often included her in activities with her friends, and Arnie not only acted as her protector, but also dedicated hours to teaching her sports like a guy. Carrie didn't throw a run like a girl, excelling in basketball, football, or street hockey with the toughness of any boy. Arnie took immense pride in his younger sister. 2 days later, we received confirmation of the grim news. Tracy, Ellie, and I convened what would become the most significant family gathering we'd ever had in the living room. We unanimously concluded that we had to inform Carrie of the truth without delay. After consulting Arnie and receiving his concurrence, we realized the gravity of the situation. It was a rare sight to see Arnie so emotional, not since he was 10 years old and got hit by a baseball, leaving a painful welt on his back, had I witnessed him cry like that. After a brief pause, he apologized to me, expressing regret for his tears and absence during such a crucial moment for his sister. The following morning I felt like a member of a firing squad as we, along with the doctor, entered Carrie's room. Although Dr. Rao had volunteered to deliver the somber news, our family deliberated and decided that one of us should take on the task. It fell upon me to perform what was perhaps the most daunting responsibility I've ever faced. Tracy and Ellie sat beside me, tears streaming down their faces, and even Dr. Rao appeared visibly moved. Surprisingly, Carrie received the news with remarkable composure, occasionally seeking clarification from Dr. Rao, who responded softly, "That settles it then. I've got this, Dad." Oh, to possess the boundless enthusiasm and courage of a 14-year-old. 9 months later, Carrie's situation hadn't improved much. Dr. Rao broached the topic of a bone marrow transplant for the first time. We had done some research and knew that siblings had a 1 in 4 chance of being a match. Arnie and Ellie were tested immediately, but neither matched. This meant we had to rely on the slim chance of finding a match on the National Bone Marrow Registry, unless... I had been quietly monitoring Rick Gardino for over 14 years, ever since the day I confronted him in the back parking lot of First National Financial. After our altercation, I left him on the ground near his car, intending never to cross paths with him again. Yet now Carrie needed him, or at least his offspring. Gardino now resided and worked 2 towns away from us, about an hour to the west. I knew he wouldn't be thrilled to see me. Frankly, I wasn't thrilled about having to see him either. "I'm at a loss for where to begin, Tommy," Tracy whispered barely audible one Saturday night after putting the kids to bed. We sat in the family room with me sipping rye and her sipping Merlot. She had mentioned she needed to talk. I had no idea what to expect. "I'm pregnant, Tommy, there's no sugarcoating it, I messed up, I really screwed up, Tommy." I sat there in shock, unable to speak. Shock. After Ellie was born 5 years ago, Tracy had asked me to get a vasectomy and I had agreed. Obviously this child she was carrying wasn't mine. When my brain finally kicked back into gear, I felt the bile rising in my throat. I barely made it to the bathroom before last night's dinner made a reappearance. I tied myself up and returned to the family room, finding Tracy still there, visibly uncomfortable. Wrestling my seat, I shot her a pointed look, prompting her to speak. "I'm 2 months pregnant," she murmured. "You know I'm against abortion and I know you are too. What are our options?" "Our options? Who's our Tracy? Are we talking about you and me or you and your partner?" Tracy appeared stricken, and I suspected her distress was genuine. "So who's he, Tracy? How long has this been going on?" I demanded, my tone harsh. My stomach twisted. I was seething with anger. I was on the verge of using physical force like never before. Her expression changed from shocked to scared. Rick Giardino from work. Do you remember a trip to London a couple of months ago?" "Yes, I can put it all together," I muttered. "You had an unprotected intimacy with him. How many times, genius? We haven't used protection for 100 years since you had a vasectomy. I guess I just stopped thinking about it. I guess we got carried away, maybe 5 times, she admitted hoarsely. In 5 days? You're moving fast, I snapped back. Those were the only times, I swear, she pleaded. I covered my face with my hands. Whether I believed in all this or not, it didn't matter now. My once perfect world has irreparably collapsed. "I'm sorry, Tommy. Really. I never meant to hurt you," Tracy apologized. "You cheated on me with another man several times and now you regret it. What the hell did you think would happen when I found out?" I shouted. Shock showed on her face. I had never talked to her like that before. "I didn't expect you to find out. You wouldn't have known if I hadn't gotten pregnant, it didn't mean anything. It was just intimacy," she blurted out. "So if I had never found out, everything would have been fine?" I asked. "What have I done to deserve such disrespect?" "I didn't think so, Tommy, I still love you. Our relationship has soared, do you understand? It was just something else, a little bit of excitement. It's just a game. Oh, so we should have discussed our problems and maybe I could get some privileges too." She muttered, great reaction. So what now, Tommy? Well, in an ideal world I would have killed him, but I know it's unrealistic. And if I divorce you, I'll lose Arnie and Ellie. I can't let that happen. I entered our bedroom and packed a suitcase while Tracy sat in tears in the family room. 2 weeks holed up in a shabby hotel room didn't offer any fresh perspectives on my predicament. I longed for my kids deeply, speaking to them every night over the phone. Each evening after their updates, Tracy would tearfully plead for my return. Struggling to juggle your affairs while being a single parent? I blurted out one night. Tracy dissolved into tears on the other end of the line again. God, I was weary of that routine. Why the hell are you crying? You're the one who caused this by breaking your vows, I shouted at her. Numbers have a calming effect. They can immerse you, offering a temporary escape from troubles. My work provided that refuge. Numbers are devoid of emotion. I craved clarity and numbers provide just that. Eventually I arrived at a solution. Not necessarily a good one, but a solution nonetheless. I approached Rick Gardino, Vice President of First National Financial, in the employee parking lot as he was about to get into his Lexus. Despite his larger size, I met him with a mixture of surprise and anger. After hitting him 2 hard blows, I heard him scream, and then I hit him hard, causing him to collapse to the floor. After that, I loudly stated my point. Listen, I shouted. If you get close to my wife Tracy again, I'll make sure that your next meeting with me is much worse. Do you understand? He groaned in apparent agreement when I noticed that other employees had witnessed the altercation, which probably prompted them to call the police. After leaving the scene, I headed home. Tracy was shocked to see me back, but she had to wait her turn to get attention, as Arnie and Ellie literally stunned me with their reaction. When Tracy reached out to hug me, I held her back and she was clearly offended. I assured her that we would discuss everything after we put the children to bed. I brought out the rye and wine for our conversation. Though I call it a conversation, it was more of a monologue from me after confirming she still loved me and wanted to stay married. I proposed that if she reaffirmed her commitment we would remain married, and I would raise her baby as my own, on the condition she never revealed the child's true paternity to Rick. This revelation shocked her as our families and closest friends knew I had a vasectomy, essentially exposing me as Tracy's cuckold. I explained that while I wasn't comfortable raising another man's child, I didn't want to miss out on watching my children grow up due to her mistake. I cautioned her that I wouldn't tolerate another indiscretion, and regaining my trust might be a long process if it happened at all. I assure you, Tommy, I'll be the most devoted wife, and I'll never give you a reason to leave us again, she exclaimed. We'll have to wait and see, Tracy. We'll have to wait and see, he replied. I realized I had made things easier for Tracy when Rick resigned from his job the day after our discussion. A month later they relocated as he took on a new job. It seemed Rick wasn't well liked at his former workplace, as the police never showed up after I confronted him in the parking lot, despite several of his coworkers witnessing the altercation. Both of our families weren't oblivious, so there was a lot of concern expressed when we announced Tracy's pregnancy. The inquiry started from my family, led by my mother. She was furious at Tracy, to put it mildly. She's making a fool out of you, Tommy. Everyone knows you're being deceived, she yelled at me over the phone after we shared the news of the pregnancy. I was taken aback by my mother's familiarity with the term cuckold. While I couldn't entirely disagree with her, I elaborated on my perspective to my family members, and they grasped my point. However, this didn't mean they approved of it, especially my father, who was clear in expressing his disapproval. You certainly didn't inherit being timid from me, Tom. At least there was no shouting from Tracy's family directed at me. I suspect they were too ashamed of Tracy's actions to even meet my gaze. We had never disclosed my vasectomy to our other children, so we simply informed them of Tracy's pregnancy. They took the news well. Rick's complexion and hair shade are darker compared to mine, but I was fortunate that Carrie bore a striking resemblance to her mother, featuring similar facial traits, blonde hair and fair skin. Nobody even questioned it. Moreover, it was beneficial that from a very young age, Carrie was deeply attached to me, often trailing behind me like a loyal puppy whenever I was home from work. She was charming, a bit of a tomboy, and just as lovable as my other 2 children. I truly believe I treated her no differently from Arnie and Ellie. except perhaps for indulging her a bit more given her status as the youngest. Now, my child was in a life-and-death struggle. I required more than Rick Gardino's personal anguish. Aware that Gardino and his spouse had 3 children, I realized they could potentially be half-siblings to my Carrie, giving them a 1 in 8 chance of being a tissue match. The following evening after dinner, I drove to his residence. He visibly recoiled upon opening the door and finding me on his doorstep. I haven't been near her, I swear," he exclaimed, raising his hands defensively. "I know you haven't. I'm not here to confront you. I need your assistance." I could see the surprise almost causing him to faint. "Did she finally leave you for someone better, you jerk?" he retorted with a smirk. "I don't need you for her. I need you for someone else. My younger daughter. And actually, I don't need you, just some samples from your children." Asswipe proved to be more astute than I initially thought. He quickly grasped the essence of my words. "I have another daughter and she's experiencing some kind of medical emergency." Damn. Why didn't she inform me? I had a right to be informed. At that moment, his wife appeared at the door. He raised his hands in a gesture of surrender. "Is everything all right, Rick?" she inquired. I glared intensely at Rick. "Yeah, babe. Everything's fine. Just an old friend from the past," he replied. "We're going to grab a quick drink at the line. Be back soon." I motioned towards my car. We drove in silence for a couple of miles before taking a table at back of the bar. "You weren't entitled to know anything," I stated after we each had a shot of Jack Daniels. "She's my daughter. Always has been. Always will be. That was the price Tracy paid for staying in our marriage. You paid in suffering. So why now? What do you want?" "My child needs a bone marrow transplant. My other kids aren't matches. We need to have your kids tested. They each have a 1 in 8 chance of matching. It's the best shot my Carrie has." Asswipe lowered his gaze to the table. In normal circumstances, I would have had to coerce approval from him. However, this request was for a child. Technically his child. "I understand time is of the essence. I'll have them tested tomorrow," he murmured. "Thank you," I replied in the same subdued tone. He never inquired about seeing any photos of Carrie. I never offered to show him any. We sat in silence until we finished our drinks. Then I drove him home. We shook hands before he exited my car. I assured him I wouldn't divulge anything to his wife. He could come up with any excuse he wanted. I had given him the email address of the hospital where Carrie was. I didn't anticipate it. "Tom, can you explain why I received 4 tissue samples from the Gardino family? They all tested negative as anticipated, given our lack of familiarity with them," Dr. Rao inquired during our phone call a few days later. "What do you mean you don't know who they are?" I responded, my tone escalating. "They're all related to Carrie by blood. One is her biological father, and the other 3 are her half-siblings." "Oh darn," Dr. Rao interjected. "I suppose I didn't anticipate that. Tom, I hate to break it to you, but none of those individuals are biologically related to Carrie." "Why did you assume they were?" "Damn it, Doc, because I'm the most foolish man alive. That's why," I yelled. Tom, the doctor called out, pulling me back to reality. "Don't make any rash decisions. Too late for that, document. She betrayed me and got pregnant, claiming it was Rick Gardino's child. She begged for forgiveness, swore she still loved me, and I fell for it hook, line, and sinker. I understand this feels devastating, Tom, but perhaps there's still a chance to salvage something from this. We just need to determine if her lover has offspring, and if we can conduct tests promptly. There might still be hope. But Carrie's condition is deteriorating rapidly. I'm on it, document. I'll keep you informed of developments." After 40 minutes, I burst into the First National Financial Office, rushing past the reception desk as if my pants were ablaze. The security guard attempted to halt me, but couldn't catch up as I sprinted to the elevator and pressed the button for the 2nd floor. Exiting the elevator, I barged into the office of Tracy Sheehy, the vice president. "End the call, Tracy." Immediately I bellowed at her. She complied instantly, staring at me with fear in her eyes. I must have been breathing heavily like an enraged bull and drooling like a Saint Bernard. I need a name now. It wasn't Rick Gardino. He and his kids have no connection to Carrie whatsoever. No further explanation was necessary. She broke into tears. I wasn't in the mood. Cut the fake tears or I'll come around that desk and give you a slap. If it wasn't Rick, then it must have been Chester Dowd. He's a First National employee from London. The night I didn't sleep with Rick, I slept with him. We only had intercourse once. I'm sorry, Tommy. Truly. I couldn't bring myself to tell you about the second man. I wasn't sure you'd forgive me for one. I knew you'd divorce me if there were two. We'll address that later. Right now you need to locate this Dowd guy and have him and any children undergo a bone marrow test. Contact your HR department and get them on it immediately. Dr. Rouse says Carrie's time is running out. Chester Dowd had left First National about 3 years after his encounter with Tracy. Tracy had to explain to the First National HR department why she needed to reach Dowd, and they assisted her in obtaining the information. She then explained her requirements to Dowd, who pledged that he and his 2 children would undergo testing. The swabs for Dowd and his children arrived a week later. While they were related, their tests didn't match. In the following weeks, my wife and I didn't engage in much communication. Eventually, her curiosity prompted her to inquire how I managed to locate Gardino so quickly. I've always had his whereabouts, I responded. Trust but verify. I just wasn't aware of number 2, or I would have found him too. She lowered her head to her desk. Our routine consisted of work and visiting Carrie's hospital room. Arnie occasionally returned home to be with his sister, and Ellie spent much of her time at the hospital as well. Dr. Rouse made frequent visits. We sensed the situation was deteriorating rapidly when Carrie's usual wit faded. And then, following what Dr. Rouse described as a miraculous event, Carrie recovered, albeit it took nearly a year. A few months subsequent to Dr. Rouse's declaration of her full remission, I convened a family meeting with the children during which I disclosed all the details regarding Tracy's affair to them. The elder too had already sensed that something was amiss, prompting me to believe that Carrie should also be informed. It proved immensely challenging to reveal to my youngest that she wasn't biologically mine, yet I emphasized to all 3 that my affection for them remained unchanged. Arnie and Ellie enveloped Carrie in a comforting embrace as she wept uncontrollably for a few minutes. Then I observed her expression harden as her tears ceased. Alright, so you forgave her once, but none of us are assuming that's happening again, right? Arnie inquired. I solemnly shook my head, sparing further words. So, do I get my own room sorted, Dad? 'Cause I'm definitely coming with you, Carrie announced. At 15 years old, Carrie had the option to select which parent she preferred as her primary caregiver. Given that I had recently learned she wasn't biologically mine, her announcement caught me off guard. Tears welled up in my eyes and soon it was my turn to clear before long. I felt the embrace of 3 sets of arms around me. Once I composed myself, I gazed at all 3 children but directed my words to Carrie. It's clear that your mother and I have been in communication with your biological father, who didn't hesitate at all when your mother requested him and his children to undergo testing promptly when we were searching for tissue matches. He wasn't even aware of your existence until we found him, so you can't blame him for that. That responsibility falls on me as much as your mother's because I instructed her not to inform Gardino, who she claimed was your biological father. Therefore, she wouldn't have informed Chet Dowdy, especially since she never acknowledged to me that he was in the picture. He has since informed his wife about you, and their entire family is eager to meet you if you're willing. I believe we could plan a vacation to Great Britain later this year for the 4 of us. We embraced once more. Tracy actually attempted to contest the divorce, citing that I had forgiven her for the affair with Gardino, and the Dowd incident occurred during that same period. Are you joking, you promiscuous person? You don't get a 2-for-1 special deal on this, Tracy, I remarked. You betrayed me with 2 different men on multiple occasions. 1 is my limit. Carrie spent very little time with Tracy post-divorce. All 3 kids shared the sentiment that their mother had wronged me, but Carrie took it the hardest. I later discovered that Tracy once complained to Carrie, accusing me of sabotaging their relationship out of spite. I made a mistake, Carrie. I'm sorry. But that's no reason for your father to be so mean, Carrie told me. Really, Mom? You slept with two men in a week while you were on a business trip and you got pregnant and Dad accepted it like the man he is and stayed married to you so that we could stay a family. He gave me his love and his name even though he shouldn't have done either. How about you just shut your mouth? I think Tracy didn't take it very well. I probably should have reprimanded Carrie for saying shut your mouth, but on the other hand, she's 15 years old. And I don't completely disagree with what she said. During a junior high school soccer game on a late fall afternoon, my daughter sprinted down the field with determination, leaving only one defender and the opposing goaltender in her path. With excitement, I stood up from my seat in the bleachers, cheering her on as she executed a clever move, faking to the right before swiftly shifting to the left and outmaneuvering the defender. The goalie hesitated momentarily, then attempted a dive to the left after feinting to the right. However, my daughter had anticipated her move and swiftly struck the ball hard and low into the lower left corner of the goal. My wife and I both stood up in celebration, exchanging high fives before she sat back down. I glanced towards the team bench and shared a smile with the coach, Carrie, who responded with a triumphant gesture pointing at me. I returned the gesture with a smile of my own. At 26 years old, Carrie found herself leading the girls' soccer team at John Adams Junior High School as head coach. Overcoming leukemia in a remarkable manner, she excelled in high school soccer, securing a scholarship to Duke University, where she played for 4 years and graduated with a degree in education. Now 4 years later, she returned to coach the same junior high team she once played for over a decade ago. I took a seat wrapping my arm around my wife, giving her a gentle squeeze. Lorraine responded with her customary radiant smile. My affection for this woman and for her daughter, whom I regarded as my own, knew no bounds. Lorraine entered my life 3 years post my divorce from Tracy, bringing a refreshing change. I had scarcely ventured into the dating scene until meeting her. Unlike Tracy, Lorraine was a complete contrast, tall and slender with short brown hair. She was 15 years younger at 40, and had an active 8-year-old daughter, Stephanie. Stephanie quickly befriended my daughter, Carrie, who imparted soccer wisdom to her. After a year of dating, I proposed to Lorraine. Having experienced infidelity in her previous marriage of 10 years, she fully understood my values regarding fidelity, trust, and respect. Stephanie resembled Carrie in many ways.
Now start second story.
The Indiana sky was a vibrant shade of blue, completely clear and unmarred. Birds chirped from the branches among the fresh leaves, and crocuses, narcissus, and daffodils were in full bloom. It felt as if all of nature had conspired in a cruel joke to mock my grief. I settled into the back seat of my son's car, and we slowly drove away from the cemetery. Sally turned in her seat, offering me a sympathetic look. She reached over the seat to grasp my hand. "It was a lovely service, Mr. Moore. I'm sure Madeline would have loved it." I remained silent. Maddie had always been a joyful person who cherished nature, at least she had before Grace left. Terry glanced back at me, his eyes red with tears, but he tried to be supportive. "Sally's right, Dad. Mom would have wanted it just the way it was today." I knew they were right. Spring was Maddie's favorite season. If she had to go, I suppose this would have been the time she would have chosen, but that doesn't make it any easier when you've just buried the wife you loved for 35 years. Terry parked in front of our house, and he and Sally walked with me inside. I sank heavily onto the couch, and they looked at me with concern. "Have you heard anything from Grace?" I asked. Terry stared at the floor. "No, nothing." I nodded. I had expected that, but I couldn't stop myself from asking. In the silence that followed, Terry shifted uncomfortably and then asked, "Are you going to be okay, Dad?" How do you even answer that? I thought. Nothing will ever be okay again, but I can't say that to my son. It would only add to his worries, and he's already dealing with his own grief. "I'll be okay," I told him. "It's going to be strange living here without her, but I plan to stay busy and that will help." "That's good, Dad," Terry replied. "We've got to go pick up Lance from the babysitter now, but if you need anything at all, just call me." I stood up to see them out and nodded. "You two take good care of my grandson," I told them. After they left, I stood there looking around the home Maddie and I had shared for so many years. It was filled with memories, some good, some not so good, but it had always been full of life, and now, well, not so much. The day was still bright outside, but the light filtering through the windows seemed to lose its warmth as it entered. I sat back down and began to reminisce. My mind wandered back to when we first bought the house all those years ago. Honestly, it had been too big and too expensive for a young couple just starting out, but we fell in love with it the moment we saw it, and nothing else would do. So we emptied our savings, and my father lent me enough to cover the down payment. Even then, the monthly payments were more than I could easily manage. So Maddie started job hunting. She was lucky enough to land a position in the development office of the city's art museum. She was always skilled in communication, both written and spoken, and with her passion for art, it was a perfect match. We were, as they say, low income. We had almost no money left after paying the monthly mortgage and utilities, but we didn't mind. We were head over heels in love with each other and aspired to the American dream. Although we couldn't afford dinners and movie nights, we made up for it by making love in every room of the house. Considering how much intimacy we had, it was no surprise that Maddie got pregnant with Terry the second year after we moved into our new home. The birth was difficult. Maddie gave birth for 18 hours, but when we held this beautiful new life in our arms, everything seemed perfect. Terry was an easy baby, sleeping through the night by 6 weeks with no colic or any of the typical newborn issues. As he grew, he remained healthy and cheerful, making Maddie feel confident about returning to work when Terry was 9 months old. The museum valued her so much that they had kept her position open, so the transition was surprisingly smooth. Naturally, having a baby in the house affected our love life, but only to a certain extent. Once Terry started sleeping through the night, we were still able to be intimate frequently, and whenever Maddie had to travel for fundraising trips to other cities, she'd come back in a passionate state. I knew that the first night she was home, I wouldn't be getting much sleep. Terry was born fairly early in our marriage, but it took 5 years before we had another child. Maddie wanted to wait, partly due to the success she was experiencing in her career. By then she had been promoted to head the development department and was thriving in her role, networking with major donors, organizing fundraising events, and leading the annual membership campaign. I also believe the experience of giving birth to Terry had been challenging enough that she wasn't eager to go through it again anytime soon. In reality, we weren't even trying when Maddie became pregnant again, but as every gynecologist knows, babies have a way of arriving on their own schedule, regardless of their parents' plans. And so, Grace was born almost exactly 5 years after Terry. However, unlike her brother and despite her name, Grace was difficult from the start. She cried from the moment she was born and hardly ever stopped, except when she slept, which was sporadic and only for short periods. We had secretly taken pride in how well Terry had turned out and how easy of a baby he was. Then Grace came along and humbled us. She cried, spit up, had diarrhea and cried some more. Many times we were at our wits' end, but somehow we made it through with our sanity and marriage still intact. I think it was harder on Maddie than on me. Grace seemed to be on her better though never best behavior when I held, fed, or changed her. But when Maddie took her, little Grace would fight, cry, and generally be at her worst. It wasn't until she was almost 9 months old that she finally started sleeping through the night. The pediatrician told us that some babies are just more difficult than others, and if that's the case, Grace must have been the perfect example of a challenging baby. As she grew older, it became clear that her personality was very different from her brother's. While Terry was calm and easily immersed in his activities, Grace was constantly on the move, frequently shifting her attention from one thing to another, needing attention, and always demanding to be entertained by something new. When she turned 2, we truly understood the meaning of the terrible twos. The trouble was, she didn't seem to grow out of that phase, even as she reached 3 and beyond. No quickly became her favorite word, and she was incredibly stubborn and headstrong. Maddie would sometimes joke, "Are you sure we brought the right baby home from the hospital," on nights when Grace was particularly challenging? Another notable difference between our 2 children was their performance in school. From the start, Terry showed the drive to succeed that is often seen in firstborn children. As my father would say, he took to school like a duck to water. He wasn't a genius, but he was a diligent student who always put in the effort, and his teachers consistently praised him during parent-teacher conferences. Grace, on the other hand, was a different story. She wasn't a slow learner, far from it. She was highly intelligent, perhaps even more so than Terry in some ways. If a subject captured her interest, she would dive into it wholeheartedly, often earning top marks in her class. However, she had little patience for subjects that didn't appeal to her, and it was nearly impossible to motivate her to invest time or effort into them. As a result, she excelled in some areas but struggled in others, which significantly brought down her overall grades. Maddie and I had always dreaded the idea of Grace reaching her teenage years, and our fears were completely justified. The rebellious and independent streak she had as a child exploded into full-blown defiance when she turned 13, and it only got worse from there. She became cheeky, disrespectful, and often disobedient. When we grounded her at 16, she sneaked out of her room, took one of our cars without permission, and went out drinking and dancing with her friends. She returned home at 3 in the morning, so drunk she could barely stand, yet somehow managed to get herself and the car home safely. I suppose it's true what they say, God looks out for drunks, fools, and children. Despite everything, Grace made it to graduation, and while her academic performance was far from stellar, she did earn her high school diploma. Her transcript wasn't Harvard material, but at least she had the option of attending community college, with the hope of transferring to a better school after her sophomore year. That, at least, was our plan. However, her graduation gave us a false sense of hope. Not long after, Grace and her mother had a massive argument. I wasn't there when it started, so I don't know who instigated it, but I heard the shouting and walked in just as Maddie yelled, "I am your mother, and I will not tolerate that kind of disrespect from you, young lady." Grace shot back just as loudly, "You're not my mother, you're a bitch." Both Maddie and I were shocked, but before either of us could react, Grace burst into tears and ran up to her room. I heard the door slam, and when I tried the handle it was locked. Though I could have unlocked it with the master key, I thought it better to let things cool off, rather than force an immediate confrontation. Now, I wish I had made a different choice. We didn't see Grace for the rest of the afternoon, which was probably for the best, as Maddie was nearly hysterical. I had to focus all my efforts on comforting and calming her as much as I could. Grace didn't come down for dinner, and we assumed she was on the phone with her friends, complaining about how unfairly we were treating her. After the incident with the stolen car, I made sure to keep all the car keys in our room, and I checked them before going to bed. I didn't sleep well that night, getting up twice just to make sure Grace was still in the house. Sometime after midnight, I finally drifted into a restless sleep. When I woke up the next morning, the first thing I did was walk down the hall to check on Grace's room. I was relieved to see her door still closed, and I started to head back to our bedroom. But something made me check again, and when I tried the doorknob, the door swung open. Her room was as messy as ever, but Grace wasn't in her bed. I quickly ran downstairs and checked the rest of the house. No sign of Grace. I then went out to the garage to make sure the cars were still there. They were. I came back inside, planning to wake Maddie and tell her what I had discovered when I noticed my wallet sitting on the breakfast room table. I was certain I had left it on my dresser the night before. When I opened it, I noticed two things. The $500 I had withdrawn from the bank earlier in the week was gone, and there was a note folded where the cash had been. I recognized Grace's handwriting. "Sorry, Daddy, I took the money. I'll pay you back someday." I quickly grabbed the phone and dialed the police. "I'd like to report a missing person," I told the desk sergeant. He asked for her age and how long she had been missing. When I said she was 18 and had only been gone a few hours, he explained with some weariness that A, she was an adult and had the right to come and go as she pleased, and B, she couldn't be officially considered missing until she had been gone for over 24 hours unless there was evidence of a crime. I decided not to mention the money Grace had taken. Maddie had come downstairs sometime during my call, and as she caught on to the situation, she began pulling at my sleeve, eager to know what was happening. I showed her the note Grace had left, and she started to cry after reading it. I turned back to the phone. "Sergeant, I don't know if you have children, but if you did and they ran away like this, what would you do?" There was a pause, and his tone shifted from indifferent to empathetic. "The first thing I'd do is call all her friends to see if any of them know where she might have gone. If that doesn't help, I'd check the bus terminal since a lot of runaways go there. It's cheap and there are no hassles at the gate. And if you haven't already, try calling her phone. If she doesn't answer, leave a message." That's what I'd do. I thanked him and hung up, wondering if he had a child around Grace's age. I called Grace's cell phone, but it went straight to voicemail. "Grace," I said as calmly as I could given the situation, "please come home. I'm so worried about you, sweetheart. If you can't make it home, I'll come and get you wherever you are. If you don't want to come home, at least call and let us know you're okay. Please, sweetheart. Mom and I love you so much and we're really scared. Please." Maddie and I started calling every friend of Grace's we could think of. No one knew where she might be, or if they did, they weren't admitting it. We even contacted Terry, who had graduated from college and had his own family by then, but he hadn't heard from her either. While Terry and Grace weren't extremely close, they were closer than she was with us. He promised to inform us right away if he had any updates. Next, we went to the bus depot, desperately hoping she might still be there. She wasn't, and none of the ticket agents remembered selling a one-way ticket to an 18-year-old girl. The following days were a nightmare. After the mandatory 24 hours, we officially reported Grace as missing. The police told us they couldn't compel her to come home since she was legally an adult, but they assured us they would search for her anyway. We learned about the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children and registered Grace with them. We also discovered support groups for parents of missing children. It was alarming to find out that around 850,000 new names are added to the missing persons list each year, with nearly two-thirds being individuals under 20. However, we also learned that a similar number of entries are cleared each year as people return home or are otherwise removed from the list, which gave us some hope. I reached out to a detective agency for assistance. The agent I spoke with was sympathetic but not very optimistic. Indianapolis is surrounded by major cities within a few hundred miles in all directions, each with a large population of runaways and homeless individuals where she could have disappeared. Even if we knew where she had gone, it would be difficult to track her down if she doesn't want to be found. I'll be honest, we usually avoid cases like this because they rarely have successful outcomes. If I were you, I would continue with your current efforts. You might have just as much luck finding her on your own as with us. I left his office feeling anxious and disheartened. About 2 months after Grace vanished, I was at the office one day when my cell phone rang. "Hello," I answered, only to hear a shaky female voice say, "Daddy?" "Grace," I shouted. "Where are you, sweetie? Are you all right?" "I'm fine, Daddy," she replied. "I'm in a safe place. I just don't want you to worry about me. Please come home, Grace," I begged. "Or at least tell me where you are so I can come and get you." "No, I can't, Daddy," she said. "It's all too strange. I need to stay where I am. Oh, please come home. Mom and I miss you terribly." "I'm sorry, Daddy, I can't. I just wanted you to know that I'm okay and you don't need to worry about me. I'll call you again when I can." And then she was gone. I left work and drove to the museum to see Maddie. I didn't trust myself to deliver the news over the phone. When I entered her office, Maddie looked up, covering her mouth with her hand, her eyes widening in fear. "No, it's good news," I said quickly. "I just received a call from Grace." With that, Maddie buried her face in her desk and started to cry. I moved around to comfort her. Once she managed to calm down, I explained what Grace had said. "But when is she coming home?" Maddie asked urgently. "She needs to come home." I sighed. "Sweetheart, she mentioned she was in a safe place and plans to stay there for now. She said it's too strange for her to return home at the moment." Maddie started crying again. "She hates me," she sobbed. "I pushed her away and now she's punishing me." "No, darling, that's not true. She's just confused and unhappy, and none of us really understand what's going on with her. You need to stop blaming yourself. The argument you had wasn't the cause of her leaving, it was just a sign of her confusion. You have to believe that." I didn't think Maddie fully accepted my explanation, but she did calm down, and we found some solace in knowing that our daughter was alive and seemed okay. This became the pattern of our lives. Every few months, I'd get a call from Grace reassuring me that she was all right. She never asked for money, never revealed where she was, and refused to come home no matter how much I pleaded. Occasionally Terry would inform me that Grace had contacted him with a similar message. However, she never called Maddie, and even though I tried to downplay it, I knew it always hurt Maddie that her daughter wouldn't speak to her. We never truly came to terms with the situation, but over the years we managed to accept it to some extent. Our daughter didn't want us in her life, and there was nothing we could do about it. We still worried about her, especially when the gaps between her calls grew longer, but as far as we could tell, she was safe wherever she was, and we clung to that belief for our own peace of mind. However, our relative peace was short-lived. A new threat emerged. One day, Maddie came home from a routine mammogram with troubling news. The doctor had found a lump. "He wants me to have a biopsy," she told me. A cold sweat broke out on me despite my efforts to reassure her. "It's probably nothing, honey. Nowadays they test everything just to be safe." "You'll see," I said, holding her. But I didn't think she believed my reassurances any more than I did. It felt like Maddie and I had become characters in a tragic Greek drama, with the gods in a particularly vengeful mood. My sense of dread intensified when we received the pathology results. The lump was malignant, with poorly differentiated cancer cells. Further tests revealed that the cancer had spread to the lymphatic system. I was devastated, but I knew I had to be strong for Maddie because she would need all the support she could get. "We're going to fight this," I told her. "It's not a death sentence. Many women overcome it and go on to live long, happy lives." Maddie's oncologist was a no-nonsense professional. "We're going to tackle this aggressively," he said. "I don't want to take a gradual approach and risk letting it get away from us." When we discovered what aggressive meant, Maddie went pale and I felt like I might faint. She would need a mastectomy and the removal of her lymph nodes, followed by chemotherapy and radiation. We both cried when we got home from the doctor's office, and I cried again when I had to call Terry and break the news to him. The next chapter of our ordeal had its moments of light and darkness. The light came from the support groups we joined and the encouragement from our friends. Their sympathy and understanding helped us stay strong and uplifted. However, the surgery and subsequent treatments were incredibly challenging. Maddie struggled deeply with losing her breast. She had always been proud of her appearance, and her breasts were one of her most cherished features. Even though I tried to hide it, her surgery affected me profoundly as well. I had always admired her breasts, and the thought of her being disfigured was hard for me to bear, but I told myself to be strong and supportive. I wasn't the one battling for my life, and I resolved to remain positive and encouraging around her. "Once we beat this, I promised, you can have reconstructive surgery. They've made great advances. You'll be the envy of everyone." But when fate turns cruel, no amount of bravery or optimism can change its course. When we learned that the cancer had aggressively spread to other organs, Maddie lost her will to continue fighting. "I can't go through any more surgeries," she told me. "I don't want more chemo or radiation. I've had enough." I begged her not to give up, but she was firm in her decision, and I couldn't really fault her for it. I had witnessed how weak she had become after the surgery, and how the toxic chemicals they had injected into her had made her so ill. Given the slim chances of success, it was understandable that she didn't want to endure that suffering any longer. I also suspected there might be another reason, though I hesitated to bring it up. I worried that Maddie might see her cancer as some form of punishment for what happened with Grace. Although Maddie never voiced such a thought, I couldn't help but wonder if that was influencing her decision to forego further treatment. Once we ceased all treatment, changes began to occur rapidly. Maddie would have good days when she seemed almost normal. I remember taking her to a flower show and delighting in her enjoyment of the blooming flowers. On other days she could barely lift her head, and it was evident that her strength was draining away like water from a cracked glass. In her final days I moved her to hospice care. Most of the time she slept restlessly. When she was awake she wanted to speak, but she lacked the energy for lengthy conversations. "Rally, you know I've always loved you," she told me more than once. This saddened me as I had always known that. She shouldn't have felt the need to keep reassuring me. I simply told her that I knew she did, and that my love for her was equal. On her last day, she mustered the strength to take my hand. Grace was all she said, but I understood what she was asking. I could only shake my head. "Tell her I'm sorry for everything," she whispered before drifting back into sleep, never to awaken again. Later that night, she began Cheney-Stokes breathing and then passed away. The gods had exacted their retribution. I snapped out of my thoughts and surveyed our quiet home. Now that she was laid to rest, there was nothing more I could do for her. It was time for me to move on with my life. Those were courageous words, but they didn't reflect my feelings. There were times when I wondered how I could continue after losing the two most important women in my life. But that was merely self-pity. I had a son, a wife, and a grandchild who loved and needed me just as I needed them. Life might have lost its excitement, but I had no right to consider giving up. The following weeks were marked by new emotional challenges and indignities. The pain stemmed from the task of sorting through Maddie's belongings, her clothes, cosmetics, and other personal items. I knew I had to do it to prevent them from becoming a mournful, dusty shrine, but each item brought back its own memories, turning what should have been a straightforward task into a lengthy process that took me days. The indignities came from interactions with friends, acquaintances, and colleagues during this period. The museum where Maddie worked sent a delegation to offer their condolences. While I appreciated the gesture, I was unfamiliar with most of them, and the ornate memorial they gave me felt more like an awkward burden than a comfort. What was I supposed to do with it? Hang it above the fireplace? Many friends visited to offer their support, but their well-meaning but cliched words offered little comfort, and I found myself responding with equally worn-out replies. The most difficult were those who, unable to find anything to say, chose to avoid me out of awkwardness. I would catch them shaking their heads or glancing at me with concern when they thought I wasn't looking. I didn't hold it against them. Sometimes there's simply nothing that can be said. Since Maddie's passing, I had started regularly visiting our minister at church. Even though she was gone, I felt the need to continue these visits. Our minister was a wise and kind woman who allowed me to express my grief in her small office over a cup of tea. Along with providing spiritual support, she offered valuable insight into human nature. She was the one who helped me move beyond my self-pity. But when I went to see her this Friday, I faced a new issue that both troubled and embarrassed me. After she had poured me a cup of tea and settled into her swivel chair, I began to make my informal confession. I had a nightmare last night. I dreamt that Maddie was still alive, but she wouldn't come to me. I was lying in bed, unable to move, while Maddie just laughed and walked out the door without looking back. I felt so angry that I almost hated her at that moment. I looked up at the minister's thoughtful expression. "What's wrong with me? How can I have these kinds of feelings?" She took a sip from her cup and gazed at me intently. "Raleigh, what you're experiencing is completely normal. Though it's not often discussed, many people who lose loved ones go through periods of resentment and anger toward them." "But how can that be?" I asked. "She's dead while I'm still alive. Shouldn't she be resenting me, not the other way around?" "But don't you see?" she replied softly. "She left you alone with all your pain and sorrow. The more you love her, the more you miss her, and the more it hurts. Maddie is the source of all that pain. It's understandable that you might feel some resentment towards the person causing you so much grief and suffering." What she said made a certain twisted sense, but I still wasn't comfortable with it. What can I do to make these feelings go away? I don't want to spend the rest of my life harboring hatred towards my deceased wife. The minister gave me a small smile. "You don't need to worry about that, Raleigh. The anger you're feeling now is because you haven't fully come to terms with Maddie's passing. Everything is still too raw. Once you reach acceptance, you'll find that the anger will fade, and you'll be able to focus on the positive memories." As I left her office, I hoped she was right. It was unsettling to realize that I was harboring resentment towards the woman I had cherished for so many years. I was relieved to have had that appointment with the minister earlier in the day, because I was invited to dinner with Terry and his family that evening. The last thing I wanted was to visit them while carrying unresolved anger in my heart. Little did I know the next chapter in my story was just beginning. After dinner, Terry and I settled in the den while Sally deliberately left us alone, saying she needed to put their son Lance to bed. "What's on your mind, Terry?" I asked. "I can tell you have something to say." He fidgeted nervously in his chair and cleared his throat. "It's about Grace," he began.